Act 1. Spring. Chapter 1. Josephine Pinova, March 14th, 1906. Though her sister could see the future, Josephine Pinova didn't believe much in fate. Her spot in the neat row of typists at the Hendrickson Insurance Company was earned, despite a moderate amount of adversity and through a great deal of determination.
"You're fired."
Josie blinked up at the supervisor standing across from her desk, breaking free of the trance she often found herself in while transcribing. As long as her enchanted glasses did not display a smear of red on the page, her mind was free to wander. Pardon?"
"You are fired,"
he repeated, setting a cream-colored envelope awkwardly atop her fingers, frozen mid-keystroke.
"Effective immediately. This is your final paycheck."
Neither woman beside Josie ceased or even slowed their busy fingers, though typists were known to be extremely nosy and excellent multitaskers. Josie had never seen anyone fired, but she hadn't been with the company very long. Perhaps this was a common occurrence, or perhaps her termination specifically came as no surprise. Josie blushed, her freckled brown skin turning the shade of her dark copper hair. It was the middle of the week, the day, the workroom. A line of supervisors' offices around the room's perimeter made a cage of the large open space. The singular window refused to open more than a few inches, and employees were not allowed outside during breaks, instead confined beneath dim artificial lights. Not only was the ambiance incredibly dull, but everyone except Josie shielded their magic away by wearing a second sense ward, further desaturating the life about them. Even on the best days, Josie returned home coated in the stale stench of cigarettes, with aching wrists and a headache split apart by the constant cacophony of clacking keyboards. If she had come to Tressport to be a typist, she would have become depressed with her choice of career. Instead, clocking in each day was nothing more than another deposit in her checking account, and another tick on her calendar counting down the days to something more. Within a year, she'd be free of the place. But in the meantime, she needed it. "You can't fire me." The supervisor, she didn't even know his name, was neither sympathetic nor scornful. His remaining hair had gone white, and he gave what was left of it a disinterested scratch behind his ear. He continued in a clinical drone.
"Your performance did not align with the expectations or goals of the Hendrickson Insurance Company. We thank you for your service and wish you all the best in your future endeavors."
As he retreated down the aisle, dread descended upon Josie. She leapt to her feet, her severance payment fluttering to the floor. She stepped over the envelope to follow him. Plenty of people had said no to Josie in the past, but she had never met a rejection she did not attempt to wrestle. "Logistically, I know I was one of the most recent hires, so during a period of layoffs, I would be susceptible."
"The company is doing fine."
"To termination, but I have made fantastic strides in my work. You will not find another employee more committed than I," she promised, forcing a smile. He did not slow down his pace or spare her another glance. Typists scoffed in annoyance as she squeezed around them to keep pace.
"The company will be sorry to see you go."
He checked his silver pocket watch. They were almost to the end of the cramped row. Desperate, Josie frantically tapped the edge of her rimless glasses. "I have a lot to offer, beyond typing. I enchanted these myself." An enchanted object would catch his attention. The fact that it had been enchanted by a woman was sure to cast doubt on it as an accomplishment, but if she could prove it was useful, he was bound to concede its value, and by extension, her value. Magic was an anomaly in an office setting. Some would even call it a danger, but no manager would turn away a reliable, safe, and structured enchantment that could aid in productivity. The supervisor remained focused on the exit, but that did not mean he wasn't listening, though she had no way of knowing for sure. His second sense ward, a ring attached to the chain of his pocket watch, was small, simple, and commonplace. Most in the city wore one to spare themselves the cumbersome process of learning to regulate a messy magical signature, with the unfortunate side effect of preventing Josie from gleaning any of the bearer's feelings through magic. Josie had custom-designed her own wards and hidden them on a brass cuff beneath her sleeve, the typical placement for anyone who wore more wards than average. Her Ward Smith cousin had inscribed every protection imaginable, except a second sense ward, since it would have prevented her spell casting. But her weak second sense was not much help in assessing most situations, when everyone else concealed their own magical signatures. Josie considered taking off her glasses to display them, but thought better of it. They were prescription lenses. These highlight typos in the text so that I can produce more accurate deliverables. A flash of red painted her periphery as she passed another typist, and she pivoted toward its source. "See?" she said, pointing at the sheet as the woman continued to hammer away on the keys. "She spelled accommodate incorrectly. There should only be one M." The supervisor and the typing came to a halt as the typist squinted at her work. The wet snap of her gum chewing was somehow louder than the surrounding keyboards. When she craned her neck upward to address Josie, her frown was almost apologetic. "Accommodate is spelled with 2 M's. It's actually missing the second C." Josie's ears burned as she heard a snicker behind her, but she would not let it deter her. She stuttered out the first reply which popped into her head. "I have a bachelor's degree in linguistics."
Congratulations.
A contemptuous smile pulled at the supervisor's otherwise impassive expression.
Does this mean you can spell linguistics correctly?
Her jaw set in a determined line as she addressed him again, words sharp. "Given my skill set, perhaps I would do better with a position in another department, possibly reviewing contracts or sales."
Miss,
the supervisor said as he finally slipped free from the rows of typists to return to his office. He tugged at the length of his gray suit coat.
there is no place for you at the Hendrickson Insurance Company.
"But
Miss,"
he bit out, pressure building behind his countenance. He could not even be bothered to remember her name. Her termination was so insignificant.
your demeanor has always been relatively ostentatious, and now you are disturbing the peace. If you do not leave the premises, you will be escorted out.
Her eyes widened as she was rendered speechless. Her checkered shirtwaist and maroon skirt did not seem so ostentatious, neither did the wine color of her manicured fingernails. But as she reflected on the numerous rows of typists wearing beige skirts, their pale faces making an exceptional effort not to glance her way, she could not deny she stood apart. "I understand," Josie replied, hoarse and regretful. The supervisor rolled his eyes as he closed his office door, muttering beneath his breath. As she returned to her former station, she fantasized about having the last word. A part of her remained convinced that she could retain her job, that it was all a matter of negotiation. She could reinvent herself to meet the demands of this place. It would take a fair bit of glamour magic, some business wear, and a well-prepared argument presented in a reasonable tone. The envelope containing the measly remains of her pay was not on the floor where she had left it. She surveyed the surrounding typists with a sour taste at the back of her tongue, but they seemed far too intent on their tasks to notice her issue. "Who took the envelope?" she asked, her voice betraying her by breaking. The only reply was the hollow clacking of dozens of typewriters. The woman who sat to the right of her spared a sympathetic glance. She might have told Josie if it did not put her own social standing at risk. Josie offered her the hint of a grateful smile and winked. Then she muttered a tracing spell. It was not necessary to cast vocally, but she wanted to frighten the woman who had stolen her money. The spell was a particularly complex piece of syntax magic, designed to be learned through tutelage. Josie could not afford a tutor, so she had taught herself the spell and mastered it 5 years prior, successfully sniffing out which of her 2 sisters had taken off with a hairpin they had promised and failed to return. Most tracking spells called for specifics, but this one tethered the user to all of their belongings in the immediate area. And that money belonged to Josie. A row ahead and 3 seats to Josie's left, the envelope was tucked under a typewriter. The blonde woman in question was wearing a bold mustard dress, evidently not too ostentatious for the supervisor's standards, but clearly on trend with its puffed sleeves and fitted silhouette. Josie refused to let her last paycheck be stolen to purchase a similarly garish piece of work. As soon as she felt the invisible tether connect her to her money, she yanked on it. The force of her spell pulled Blondie's keyboard out from under her fingers, and it came crashing to the floor. The woman wheeled on Josie furiously, though she was unable to make much of a case for herself, having been caught red-handed. Instead, she just stared at Josie, attempting murder with her eyes. Chest heaving, she managed to breathe out a single word as if it were a slur. "Witch." "I sure am," Josie replied with a dejected shrug, though she could not help but admit she felt the slightest bit better. Legally, she was unsure if she was liable for the damage to the typewriter, as technically she did not perform any magic on it. Magic's place in any office was an increasing concern, and many would consider her spell worse than the theft that had prompted it. She did not loiter long enough to find out. Having worked for Hendrickson's for only 5 months, Josie had very few belongings to scoop into her purse. In one moment, she was smirking at Blondie, her sole triumph of the day, and in the next, she was on the street, basking in the midday sunlight she desperately missed during work hours. Tresport winters were harsh, but the weather was beginning to curl into spring, warm enough to forego her gloves. Horse-drawn carriages passed her on the asphalt road, punctuated by the occasional cable car or automobile. But she chose to walk from the downtown district, if only to take advantage of her bittersweet freedom. Josie took her time strolling downtown, agonized by the inevitability of explaining the afternoon to her sister, who was bound to be home. Her sister would then encourage a letter to their mother, which Josie would tactfully avoid with a groan. Losing her job was tragic enough. She did not need her mother's insistence of how terrible it and the city was. She suppressed the thought by focusing on a different letter, one she would much rather send and which warmed the pocket of her skirt. She spotted a postbox along the street, flanked by tall, imposing buildings with distinctive 3-pane windows. They varied in cladding, from terracotta to limestone to brick. Intricate detailing made distinct personalities out of each facade. But from afar, the street maintained a cohesive style, grandiose and so unlike the meager brick structures lining the main street of the town that had reared her. The letter had been in her pocket all day. It would be for the best if she amended it with the life-altering event that had passed in the few hours since she had signed it. But she could not bear to disappoint someone else, least of all the person whose opinion she cared for the most. After an uncertain pause, she approached the tawny postbox and slotted the letter in. 5 months earlier, October 17th, 1905. Dear holder of Maintaining a Scry State by George Clark, I have requested that the librarian, the ever-accommodating Mr. Birchwood, hand off this letter to you. It has been 3 weeks since your checkout has expired. I am usually not such a stickler for the rules and have a bad habit of bending them when I please, so I am not one to judge. That being said, I am in desperate need of acquiring that specific book, of which the library carries no other copies. I am studying for entrance into the University of Tresport Institute of Magic. I assume that you are a student there, seeing as to how the average person finds scrying a skill too complex for self-tutelage. But unfortunately, I am in such a position as to require that I must learn from the book. And so it is imperative that you relinquish the tome. You might think me neurotic, as the application deadline has not passed, and it is some months before I would have to prove my competency in the technical interview, if I even secured such an honor, but I abide by a rigorous study schedule. It is quite an ordeal. So please, offer a kindness to a potential future classmate. Sincerely, a friend.
Chapter 2. Aufidius Reid, March 22nd, 1906. Without fail, Aufidius Reid checked the mail each morning. On this morning in particular, he rifled through his and his roommate's bills in search of 2 very special letters. One would be postmarked from the University of Tresport, and the other would be postmarked from Miss Davis. He had no luck finding the former, but recognized the latter's handwriting on a square-shaped envelope immediately. Reid jogged back up the steps from the mailroom to his 3rd-story apartment, throwing open the door and discarding a scatter of envelopes onto an accumulating pile of neglected bills atop the kitchen table. As he was about to leave again, Reid opened the front door to see one of his roommates staring back at him, key in hand. Short on time, Reid tabled the pleasantries. "Were you at the racetrack or with a woman?" he asked Felipe, barring entrance to their shared apartment until he answered. As children, Reid and Felipe were often mistaken for siblings, given their similar brown complexions and curly black hair, but Reid had grown fairer and a full head taller. Though Felipe was better proportioned and much quicker on his feet, Reid had the advantage of magic. So Felipe Delgado did what he did best and tried to talk himself out of a compromising situation. "Both," he replied without a hint of sheepishness and all the confidence that accompanies a mischievous grin. His tan button-down shirt and black slacks weren't stained or torn, but they were still undeniably mussed from an eventful night. "Don't be sour that I didn't come home. I assure you, I'm very well rested." Reid narrowed his eyes. "You're meant to be at work right now." Both Felipe and their third roommate, Sam, began their factory shifts before sunrise. Reid's routine was to wake as they left. "I've got a new job. Lamp salesman at the shop down on Olive, and it's a position that begins at a reasonable hour, so I'll be on time too once I get ready." He gestured to the inside of their apartment. "If you please." Reid still did not budge. In fact, he seemed to take up more of the doorway as he glowered down at Felipe. If anyone needed a new job, it was Sam. He'd suffered a knee injury a few years ago metalworking, and it was only getting worse. Reid had been helping him apply to other positions for the last few weeks, with little to no avail. Lamps. What was wrong with Yucco's? "Man, do you hear yourself?" Felipe snorted. "If you think Yucco's gum factory's so great, feel free to take my old station on the line." If Felipe had hoped that his jest would elicit an eye roll from Reid, he was mistaken. Instead, his frown deepened. "Why is this the first time I'm hearing of a new job?" Felipe had ample experience with Reid's unyielding insistences over the years, but exhaustion began to thin his smile. "I wanted to make sure I wouldn't screw it up first, which will happen if I'm late. That's the only trouble I'm in. My head's still on straight, Reid, and if it wasn't, I'd tell you." Slowly, Reid deflated. For a long time when they were children, he and Felipe had nothing to lose but each other, bound together in a variety of unsavory situations just to keep one another afloat. It had been many years since then, and though once again they shared the same roof, time had put enough space between them that left sufficient room for doubt. Reid reminded himself that while Felipe may have been prone to embellishment, he would never lie to him. "Oh, and..." Felipe tilted up his head to reveal a love bite beneath his jaw. "Do you mind?" "Yes, I do," Reid deadpanned, but nevertheless reached forward and pinched the bruise. Felipe yelped in pain. Reid's natural inclination for magic had always been fickle, but this healing was so simple he did not have to think to cast it. He had only to will the bruise gone. Once Reid let go, Felipe hurried to rub the sore spot, now magically unblemished. Was that necessary? No, it wasn't. Reid suppressed a smile and stepped aside. "Very funny," Felipe replied as he brushed past. Like all people, Felipe possessed some of his own magic, and like most people, he possessed no interest in learning to control it, instead opting to suppress it behind a second sense ward tucked beneath his shirt and inscribed on a pendant hanging from a gold chain. His eyes scanned Reid from head to toe, catching on the envelope in his hand. "Another letter from your secret admirer?" Reid had never planned to tell Felipe about the letters. They used to go out together, if only half as often as Felipe did on his own. He had nowhere near Felipe's charm or wit, though his height had historically accounted for much of his success in finding a companion for the night. But when the letters started, Felipe began to notice how a very certain shape of envelope soothed Reid's agitation. It became clear that an increase in the frequency of trips to the mailbox corresponded with a decrease in the frequency of nighttime excursions. "It's not a secret admirer if it's reciprocated," Reid replied as firmly as he could, though his ears threatened to turn red from embarrassment. "It definitely is a secret if you don't know who she is," Felipe volleyed back. Reid's reply lacked any playfulness. "I may not know who she is, but I know her, and she knows me." Felipe's dubious look conveyed more than words ever could, but Reid was not prepared to convince him. To begin with, he did not have the time. The letter itched in his hand, and the sooner he left, the sooner he could read it. "You're not the only one who's late for work." Reid fished for the key in his pocket to lock the apartment. Though he was less likely to be fired than Felipe, he resented the thought of tardiness. His boss grew more miserly with his forgiveness each passing day. As he stepped out the door, Reid said, more command than farewell, "Good luck, and I'll see you tonight." Taking a brisk pace in the sharp, early air, Reid exercised a great deal of self-control, refraining from tearing open the letter and devouring it on the street. It would be no disservice to Miss Davis if he stopped to read her letter beside the gentle gurgle of the Tress River, merging with the soft ambient patter of the commuter bustle. He was in the industrial section of the city, far from the commotion of newsboys hawking the morning edition of the paper, or the smell of fresh bread wafting from open bakery doors. Though there were no witnesses here to his desperation, and his only companions were concrete walks and plumes of smoke out of refinery chimneys, the letter still felt far too intimate to be consumed in public. Reid required the privacy of the back room of the apothecary to savor his letter, but that dream was swiftly dashed as he turned the corner and saw ugly gashes of red paint defacing the storefront. Reflecting the endless, still blue of Lake Ketchineppie, the Tressport apothecary glimmered in the morning sun as best it could in its current state. To allow sufficient light for the plants lining the store's walls, the storefront resembled a greenhouse with a large street-facing glass facade that ascended into half of an elliptical dome, halting at the wall splitting the front from the back room. That facade was now streaked with a stubborn red, bright and violent, and the apothecary's apprentice was already outside attempting unsuccessfully to scrub it off. "Morning." Willie's greeting was dour as he pushed a flop of honey-colored hair out of his eyes with the back of a wet, red-stained hand. His hair had grown so long it had started to curl around the bottom of his ears. He was turning 17 soon, and when he did, Reid would insist he finally get a haircut. There was a level of professionalism the apothecary demanded of its employees, and Reid had abided by it since he was 13. "How long have you been at it?" Reid nudged his head in the direction of the soapy bucket at Willie's feet. He had hardly made a dent in the large splotch wrapping around the storefront. At this point, vandalism to the shop was more irritating than surprising. Last time, the vandals had attempted to break in, not realizing the glass facade had been magically enhanced. This time, they were a successful nuisance. "For an hour, I think," Willie answered, chewing on his lower lip. He lived in the apprentices' quarters in the basement of the apothecary, taking up their residency after Reid had moved out. "I didn't realize what had happened until I finished my morning rounds in the greenhouse. I thought I'd be able to clean it all up before Mr. Gornoff awoke, but..." He groaned. "You didn't tell him?" "I didn't think it'd take this long." "It shouldn't." Reid raised his right hand to touch the dried paint. His apothecarist's ring, proof of his station, glinted on his middle finger. It called attention to how his middle, ring, and pinky fingers progressively decreased in grip strength, a disability resulting from his childhood bout with polio. He cautiously quested forward with his second sense to discover an unnatural oblong hum radiating from the paint. "Those hypocritical bastards enchanted it," he said, brushing his hands together as if he could do away with the residue of the magic. "I suppose they decided going against their morals was worth causing us an insurmountable inconvenience." Without a shadow of a doubt, the Protect Our Workers organization had done this. Since the Woolsworth Fire of 1902, they had campaigned rigorously to separate magic from the growing industrial sector of the city. Though the apothecary had been constructed atop a naturally occurring magic vortex, and thus predated the brutish and imposing factories that flanked it on either side, in the eyes of the POWO, it undoubtedly presented a danger to its new neighbors. Reid had worked at the store from apprentice at 13 to apothecarist at 25, but it had only been in the last 4 years that he'd had to deal with protesters, loiterers, thieves, vandals, and other pests. And always, it was at the hands of the POWO. Willie eyed the paint with a newfound dread, dejection tilting his lips downward. Is it really so insurmountable? Well, the vortex isn't doing us any favors, Reid sighed. Just as the vortex strengthened the elixirs and nurtured the plants within the shop, it also emboldened any enchantment in the paint. Willie chewed on his bottom lip. So what are we going to tell Mr. Gornoff when he comes down to open the shop? You, Reid emphasized, facing him fully, are going to tell him right now what happened, like you should have an hour ago. And then you'll tell him that I'm going to take care of it. I'm fairly certain I can neutralize the enchantment. Willie quickly hid the twitch of a relieved smile by ducking down his head into a nod and scurrying into the apothecary and up the stairs to Mr. Gornoff's apartment above the shop. The ingredients Reid needed for the counterspell could be found in the front, but he took advantage of the momentary quiet to slip into the back and remove the letter, burning a hole into his breast pocket. The back room was lit by a lone light bulb hanging from the ceiling and a simple brass lamp resting on the mixing and distilling station, numerous shelves of inventory casting awkward shadows. With a dusty collection of powdered drugs and herbs as companions, Reid flicked open the envelope with a small flourish of magic. He read the letter twice, but his satisfaction was painfully short-lived. "And what do you think you're doing?" Reid squinted against the light of the open door, but he recognized the voice without having to see the speaker. He knew better than to attempt a lie to the owner of the apothecary, but as he fumbled to conceal the letter, any attempt at a response lodged in his throat. As Reid's eyes adjusted to the influx of light, he could make out Mr. Gornoff's tight frown. "Come out to the front. I need to speak with both you and William." Chamomile rays of sparse morning light filtered through the large splotches of paint and caressed the plants arranged along the storefront window. The vegetation, left neglected and shadowed, hummed with disappointment. A greenhouse adjoined to the apothecary provided fresh ingredients, but certain species flourished in the company of people, and so they were arranged sporadically throughout the store among the shelves of elixirs, bombs, and powdered ingredients. Reid and Willie stood beside a verdant fern placed on the checkout counter. It enjoyed the sound of the ring for an employee bell, lopsided as its branches extended in an embrace toward the sound. "Something must change," Mr. Gornoff said as he paced in front of the counter like a customer debating whether or not to check out. His white hair had become too fine in old age to gel back, so he kept it short and unstyled. To compensate, his suits always caught the eye, like today's royal purple ensemble complete with a lavender pocket square. He looked at Reid as if he expected him to chime in, but Reid had nothing to offer. Mr. Gornoff twisted his apothecarist's ring in thought. Though it was tradition to wear it on his right hand, Mr. Gornoff insisted on wearing it on his left, beside his wedding band. "Offering pharmaceuticals is not enough. Since the last of the healers down the street shuttered their doors, no one else has referred clients here. Now the mess with the vandalism." He swatted in the direction of the window. "Everyone is becoming so wary of the old remedies. The world is shifting rapidly, and we must reorient ourselves within it." Reid braced himself for Mr. Gornoff's request. The old remedies was a polite way to reference the low magics, traditions like healing and occupations like warder or apothecarist that had been passed down through the generations by mentorship. With the advent of newer technologies, faith in the old remedies dwindled and was almost lost entirely after the fire. More and more people were beginning to believe that magic had no place in industrialized society, as it was too volatile. The shop had adjusted by fulfilling a limited number of pharmaceutical orders, only possible because of Reid's pharmacist's accreditation. It had been a 2-year degree, completed while caring for the shop between classes and studying for exams between customers. The study had been tolerable and the accreditation achieved solely for the sake of the shop. Though Reid did wish to return to school, if he did, it would be to pursue one of his genuine interests. How, sir? Willie could not stop fidgeting with his hair. Reid was sure Willie would rather be fired than tasked with outreach. I reached out to an old friend of mine, a journalist, Mr. Gornoff replied. He's going to come into the shop tomorrow and ask a few questions. I expect you both to be on your best behavior. Willie and Reid shared a glance. He addressed them as if they were two misfits. When Reid was nearly a decade Willie's senior and both had an aversion toward trouble. But best behavior was something relative. On the selling floor, a smile from either was rare and, doubtless, at least one was expected when assisting customers. What is the nature of his article? Reid asked. We are the last live apothecary in Tresport, Mr. Gornoff replied, unable to suppress the proud puff of his chest. His family had founded the first apothecary in the city, nestled in the waterside's now all but defunct magic district. I never saw those other chaps as competition, but we've outlasted them. But what about the university? Willie questioned. What about it? Mr. Gornoff's countenance soured. He kept a few university contacts, but he rarely had a good word to offer beyond a handful of friendships with professors. They have a live apothecary as well, don't they? Willie pointed out, but then attempted to mend his error when he noticed Mr. Gornoff's puckered expression. I mean no disrespect by it. It's only, if the journalist asks, I don't know what to tell him, you know? You can tell him that at the university's apothecary, the students won't have to spend the next 3 hours cleaning red paint off the windows. Reid thought, but said nothing. There was a legitimacy lent to universities. Structured academia was viewed as the proper step in magical development, while the old remedies were left behind. The POWO never targeted universities, as they were a controlled and stabilized entity entirely divorced from the variable or even precarious customs from which they stemmed. It did not matter that there was a rising academic discipline seeking to merge magic and industrialization. The study was protected by the industrial nature of the university itself. Reid personally knew one of the professors in the field, Charles Cavendish Porter, and he had never made any complaints of the Protect Our Workers organization demanding he give up his line of work in metal alchemy. You will not be responding to any question to which you do not know the answer. Mr. Gornoff shook his head. And if you find the university's apothecary a suitable substitution for ours, then feel free to carry out the remainder of your apprenticeship there. Willie frowned. For how much he valued his position, his tongue slipped far too often. The apprentice had come recommended due to his aptitude for chemistry and a fair intuition for magic, but, most importantly, he had the stereotypical disposition for the job. He was perfectly polite in the professional sense, but could not carry a conversation with a customer beyond spelling out their total bill. I suppose that is the one difference. Willie contemplated a spot on the wall over Mr. Gornoff's shoulder. If the journalist asks, I'll be sure to tell him that they are functionally identical, but the university is worked by students and personnel with actual degrees. Do I have it correct?" Reid stifled a smile. There were many times in his childhood when he wished to verbally get his licks in against Mr. Gornoff, but he was never allowed the same grace as Willie. "What you would tell Mr. Cunningham is that apothecaries have existed before universities, and they would have nothing to develop or expand upon if it weren't for our history." He made the move to massage his temples, but thought better of it. "You are part of a proud tradition, William. Represent it well." Reid tilted his head sympathetically in Willie's direction. "You know, we are similar. Many are under the false assumption that because the university is the only place to study high magics, they must have a better understanding of the apothecary sciences. But our remedies are the same. You've made specialty ingredient deliveries to the university before. They're our clients. They may perform research that we do not, but they do eventually publish their discoveries for our use." Reid gauged Mr. Gornoff's reaction. All he had shared was true, but Mr. Gornoff seemed fixedly unwilling to concede anything to the university or Reid. Reid had grown accustomed to the old man's cold shoulder, but it had grown colder with each passing year since the death of his wife. The distant chime of the grandfather clock informed the room the shop was now open. Refusing to meet Reid's gaze, Mr. Gornoff said, "At the end of the month, I sliced through at least a dozen letters asking if I'd be willing to sell my apothecary. The shop has been in my family for 4 generations." He displayed 4 fingers in emphasis. "And there was not an offer in the world that could entice me to part from it. But—" Mr. Gornoff paused as if something was caught at the back of his throat. Such a particular look of grief flickered across his face. Reid was afraid someone had died. Perhaps it was the inherent violence of the vandalism attempt. This had been an attack, and perhaps Mr. Gornoff would finally acknowledge the POWO as a threat. He did not. "That being said, if we cannot reach and maintain the same volume of sales we were making 5 years ago, I will no longer be able to afford the overhead. We need the money and only have until August, 5 months, to make that goal before my reserves are spent through. Mr. Cunningham will be here at 3 p.m. Do not embarrass me. And by God, make sure the window is clear by the time he arrives." October 19th, 1905. Dear holder of the History of Metal Alchemy by Felix Davis, thank you for your courteous letter, though I will admit I was torn on how to respond. I possess dual motivations. On one hand, you and I find ourselves in similar positions. I, too, am studying for entrance into the university. Like you, I do not have the resources for a tutor or the funds to purchase any of these books for myself. I can empathize with your plight. On the other hand, I also recognize that we are positioned as rivals. As much as I desire to prolong the suspense, you have already found this letter tucked safely within your precious Maintaining a Scry State by George Clark. My decision is obvious. You are very welcome. You have a difficult enough road ahead of you, and I do not wish to obstacle it further. I'll be frank. I did not hoard your book out of negligence. Every second that it was in my possession, I studied it thoroughly. And yet, I have not been able to hold a scry state for more than 30 seconds. I do not know if you've been faced with a similar issue. I possess an intuitive talent for magic, but it is so erratic that in most cases it acts more as a hindrance than an aid. Now that I know your weakness, a neurotic reliance on books, it is only fair that you know mine. And just as I have offered the book as a symbol of goodwill, I hope that you can offer some insight into my problem. Once you make sense of scrying, be sure to let me in on the secret. In the meantime, I have inquired of the ever-accommodating Mr. Birchwood as to who you are. He offered no specifics, but did share with me that you possess an overdue library book of your own. When you're done with it, hopefully soon, I would like to read it. I eagerly await seeing the history of metal alchemy on the shelves, for then I know that I will find your reply to this letter within. Sincerely, Mr. Prior, holder of Maintaining a Scry State by George Clark.
Chapter 3. Josephine Pinova, March 22nd, 1906. All Josie had ever wanted to do was study magic. Everyone in her family was magical in one way or another, but Josie would be the first to go to school for it. Though she had been a voracious learner as a child, she only seemed to find success picking up magic from a spell book. So naturally, after she discovered there was a place dedicated to the study of spell books, she had asked incessantly if she could one day attend the University of Tresport's Institute of Magic. And finally, when she had turned 18 and her time had come, her mother had not permitted her to apply, asking pointedly where they would find the money. So, instead, Josie enrolled in the university where her father taught math, one of the few options she could afford. Since it was a women's college, it offered not a single curriculum in magic, and she found herself in a linguistics program. Linguistics was compelling enough to earn a degree in, but not enough to make a career out of, and she hoped, if anything, it would look appealing on her graduate school application. Graduate programs at magical institutes preferred a magic-focused degree when applying, so she was operating at a disadvantage. But Josie had already overcome so many more pressing and immediate obstacles, like convincing her mother to let her leave Summerford and scrounging up the funds to do so, that an admission offer from the state's most prestigious university seemed meager in comparison. She had already done the work and knew her profile met their requirements. Her application was as sound as it could be, and Josie found a place to stay in the city by means of her sister's aspirations. Juniper Pinova was born with the rare gift of clairvoyance, an ability to glimpse into the future. She found little luck in refining any other natural talent she possessed, and insisted she make a name for herself in Tresport as a fortune-teller, the only place for miles where her gift could find an audience. In Summerford, she would have been relegated to a cheap booth at the fair, or maybe a show with the circus. But in the city, she could be hired out to wealthy parties, or perhaps even amass the popularity to set up her own shop. Though bothered with none of the social concerns of sending off her unwed 21-year-old daughter, their mother had feared for Juniper's safety in such a large city, especially one with rising reports of corruption and crime. But when Josie offered to chaperone to mitigate the risks, the two sisters quickly wore down their mother's willpower. And so, Josie was closer to the institute than she had ever been before, but in desperate need of the capital required to stay in the city. "Can you please take a look at the classifieds and tell me where I have a real shot at getting hired?" Josie asked her sister. They sat together at their small dining table, Josie lifting a handheld mirror so Juniper could better see where she was applying kohl. She carefully aligned the applicator along her lower lash line and closed her eyes as she swiped the powder across. Their tiny two-bedroom apartment did not have the space for a vanity, though Josie did her best to infuse the living room with homeliness by hanging various ferns and ivy from the ceiling. She installed blue-striped wallpaper to cover the drab paneling and enchanted it to keep the air smelling of lemongrass to prevent their suffocation from the overwhelming wash of vinegar from the pickling factory next door. "Sure." Juniper paused to take a look at the open newspaper Josie slid across the table. Bright red X's riddled the landscape of the page, each dramatic slash representing a failed interview. It was an impressive accumulation after only a week of unemployment. She mulled, feigning deep thought before pointing at the last listing surviving in a long row of red. "That one'll make a bingo." Josie might have laughed if rent was not due in a week. "I can't believe I'm privileged enough to receive such valued wisdom and clairvoyant insight so many pay for," she deadpanned. "If you can come up with an act, I bet I can find you a gig or two," her sister replied unhelpfully, applying kohl to her second eye. Juniper discovered that she made more in tips by leaning into the exotic mystique, and kept herself well stocked with supplies by asking their bobo to send cosmetics via their family in Chemet. "I'd have more luck as your assistant," Josie sighed. Unfortunately, she lacked any affinity in the intuitive magic her sister knew as naturally as breathing. Instead, Josie knew plenty of spells. Maybe too many spells, as she was well versed in structured magic after years of dedicated study. "Anyone can learn what I do." Juniper rolled her eyes before refocusing on the mirror. She angled her blush application upward, accentuating her sharp facial structure. The sisters' darker coloring and red hair were near identical, but Juniper looked as if Josie's features were refined on a whetstone. They had similar heart-shaped faces, large brown eyes, and full lips, but Juniper's jaw was sharper, her eyes more angled, and her Cupid's bow more pronounced. With softer features, many assumed Josie was the younger sister, though in reality, she was 3 years older. "Anyone can learn to do what you do, but they can't do it like you do," Juniper said. "You've been putting on a show your entire life. This is just the kind you put on for rich white men, so it pays better." "I have stage fright." "Just imagine they're all in their underwear. It's very effective." Josie placed the mirror on the table. "Oh, come on now. Are you being serious?" Juniper clicked her tongue and prodded at her with a lazy wisp of magic, leaving a strip of goosebumps along Josie's arm. She gestured for the mirror, but Josie scowled, and instead spelled the mirror to float on its own as she leaned backward with crossed arms. Her sister was poorly practiced in any magic beyond her unique specialty of clairvoyance, so her attempt at a similar spell would result in the mirror either pelting across the room or shattering completely. "Thank you," Juniper conceded, giving her sister a pitying look before pulling out a bullet of rouge from her moss-colored purse. "Okay, perhaps I wasn't so serious. What do you want me to say? You've tried it all. It would be a quick commute to the pickle factory, but you refuse a second sense ward. And frankly, it'd be a waste of your talents. There sure isn't a listing for a linguist in that newspaper, and you lack experience in anything else. Girls who look like us don't get hired on the floor of department stores." Juniper tapped her cheek for emphasis, the same sandy brown shade Josie had inherited from their father, though hers was unblemished where Josie's was freckled. She then cast her sister a knowing look. "We know what happened during your last secretarial interview, refusing to be at the beck and call of some man who isn't as smart as you. I'm surprised you found a job as a typist." Josie almost wished her sister would lie to her. She groaned, face turning red, and placed her head in her hands. "I suppose it shouldn't have come as a surprise when I lost it." "Hey," Juniper snapped her fingers as an idea came to her. "Perhaps you could find another witch's emporium in the city and go work for them. You do have experience." "Absolutely not." The assistance work Josie had done for her mother had been both tedious and frustrating. Their mother was a healer, a common enough talent among witches, but one that Josie was unable to learn through apprenticeship, as she was too poorly suited for the intuitive magics. Like most students of structured magics, she could only learn the very basics of her mother's trade through spells rather than through traditional observation. Josie had perfected executing her spells so they seemed like intuitive castings, effortless like her mother's. But in striving to appear more like her family, she became their black sheep. The Pinovas had practiced magic for generations, passing down tips and talents, making a profession out of homegrown hexes and healings. But not a single member had ever thought to study magic academically. The privilege of studying high magics was only allowed to a wealthier class. Though it would be nice to be around magic, those positions have long-term expectations. I do not plan to stick around for very long. Well, then I'm out of ideas. Her sister returned all of her compacts back into a purse that appeared too petite to accommodate everything she stuffed into it. You seem married to the typist position, so perhaps you should return to argue against the divorce. Beg them to take you back. Do you remember Angel? Josie could not believe the turn of the conversation. Your former boyfriend? Yes, him, Juniper snapped. 4 months go by, and we're having a great time. One day, out of the blue, he says we should quit. Apparently, I did a poor job of looking after his emotional needs. She outlined the phrase by gesturing with emphasis. I went home and had a good sniffle over it. Then the next day, I told him he was being ridiculous. Why throw away all our fun over a couple of pesky concerns about emotional needs? Josie wished there was a third party to witness this bout of insanity, but she could only exchange a side-eyed glance with some ivy draped from the ceiling. Juniper, that's about the worst advice I've ever heard. It's no wonder you two broke up. Yes, only because he started crossing his arms and pouting whenever we went out. Juniper reenacted the scene with an exaggerated flair, but with such uncanny likeness it prompted a small smile from her sister. Of course, I didn't actually fix any problem we had, but do you know what I did get? One more month of fun. She squinted. And what is the point? My point is that your career as a typist is doomed to begin with, so you might as well squeeze every last penny from it. Juniper's audacity never failed to amaze Josie. But what was worse, she genuinely considered this advice. Josie could not think of the events of the last week without her stomach uncomfortably lurching, but she was no stranger to embarrassment. It was an obstacle to overcome, like any other in life. Sometime in May, she would receive her acceptance into the Institute. Josie had placed every spare dime she had been gifted or earned at her family's emporium for the last 15 years into a savings account and earmarked it for tuition. Under no circumstances would she dip into it for anything other than school. There was no life for her back in Somerford, only her family's expectations. She had attended university there, but her professional network was threadbare, and the only close relationships she had developed with her classmates were a number of unserious romantic flings. No, her life was in Tresport, and to stay here, she only needed to keep her position until classes began in the fall. Fine. Josie reached out and tugged on the handle of the mirror, commanding it to cease floating, and it settled onto the table. Fine? I will go back tomorrow and beg for my job, though there are several issues with that course of action. Whatever it is, just magic your way out of it. You always do. Juniper said, growing antsy. She was due for her party in half an hour and needed to leave within the next few minutes to catch her cable car. She had sensed it would come early, and she complained incessantly all morning of feeling rushed. Josie gave her a halfway cross look. That is illegal. Only if you magic them, Juniper said, as if the conclusion was obvious. It was not. They weren't impressed with my glasses. Even then, the creation wasn't entirely her own. Her knowledgeable but entirely anonymous correspondent, Mr. Clark, had helped her. She had yet to tell him about this mishap, and elected to avoid writing another letter until she found herself employed again. If she told him the truth, he would be nothing but sympathetic and kind, as he always was. But her need to impress him was an aggressive motivator. Then magic yourself. That's still legal. Only within reason. She nodded. So stay within reason. Once you convinced Ma you could sense someone's broken bones, when in reality you'd whipped up a potion that let you see through anything softer than stone. Just do that, but for whatever typists consider impressive. It was not the best example. Josie's dosage had been too strong, and she was not able to complete her schoolwork because she saw right through the words on the page. She eventually admitted her mistake to their mother and atoned through much scolding and bone-weary chores. Though her mother did not approve of her homegrown experiments, she never confiscated her materials, and perhaps they were all the experience she needed to secure a job. October 26th, 1905. Dear Mr. Maintaining a Scry State by George Clark, to thank you for your kind return of the hostage, I will gladly share what assists me in scrying. I am unsure if my advice will be relatable, as I regrettably have very little intuition for magic, but I hope you find it helpful. All the books insist that you must first clear your mind and go into the spell with the intention of letting the magic guide you to your request. That suggestion is too abstract for me. I have never let magic guide me. Instead, it is something I investigate. So I begin scrying with a question and think of the spell as its answer. For example, I attempted to scry for my youngest sister's cat. I entered the spell, asking what the cat was doing at that very moment. He was then displayed on my mirror, and my question was answered. He was napping. But to continue in the scry state, my interest in the subject must continue strong and unbroken. So I ask another question. Is he happy? What occupies his dream? When will he wake up? As long as I can think of new questions to continue the dialogue between me and the spell, my mind does not wander, and I am fixed in the scry state, even if I never receive an answer. I watch the cat sleep for 3 minutes, lost in all the inquiries I had built around him, before I realized he could not answer 90% of them. He is a cat. But the technique is effective, nevertheless. Now I have a request for you. I, too, did not hoard this metallocemy book out of negligence. I am working on an enchanted pair of glasses. I have already discovered the runes I will need and structured them into a spell. Unfortunately, they are runes best suited for a metallic medium. The enchantment must pass to the glass. To some degree, that is the basis of all enchantment, transferring the bound magic from the object to the person or thing possessing it. But I do not know how to convince the metal that the glass is wielding the spell. Perhaps I am overcomplicating this. Since you can now study metallocemy, you are in a position to help me. If you are interested, reply with your suggestion to my P.O. box enclosed below. Your friend, Miss The History of Metallocemy by Felix Davis.
Chapter 4. Aufidius Reid, March 23, 1906. Mr. Cunningham believed in the power of comprehensive journalism. Reid had thumbed through his hoarded backlog of newspapers and was surprised to find Mr. Cunningham's byline under a number of serious articles: natural disasters, malpractice suits, labor strikes. He was no doubt featured in a number of muckraking magazines, and as he stood in the center of the shop that afternoon, it was clear he approached his coverage of the apothecary with no less dignity or fervor. He was a short man, though everyone seemed short to Reid, and was dressed in an economical brown suit matching economically trimmed hair of the same color. His skin and eyes were startlingly pale, given the effect of translucency, so when he looked at someone it felt as if he were looking straight through them. Splitting the intensity of his gaze between Willie and Reid, Mr. Cunningham explained at length how an investigation was best undertaken through all 5 physical senses. He had sniffed the air, taken careful steps around the storefront to test the creak of the hardwood boards, and skimmed his fingers along the various greenery. Reid warned that while touching the leaves was acceptable in the front, he would have to be careful in the greenhouse as some plants were not as friendly. Mr. Goranoff refused to leave his employees unsupervised with their guest. He even went so far as to remove his second sense ward to better observe the situation. Though he could not gain any additional insight into Mr. Cunningham's reactions, as the journalist wore a second sense ward of his own, he could keep a better eye on Reid. As Mr. Goranoff pretended to tidy near the shelf of healing balms, Willie stuttered through an interview. Apprentices were the main caretakers of apothecary greenhouses, and Mr. Cunningham was curious about all aspects of day-to-day operations. Then, with the gentle tinkle of the bell hanging above the front door, she walked in. The young woman embodied a flame as neatly as one could. It was no rarity to see those who practiced magic visit the apothecary, but she shone brighter than most. She was dressed in a cream shirtwaist and a maroon skirt, the rich color complementing her voluminous sweep of reddish hair, which was secured into a low pompadour under a sensible straw hat. A few wayward locks had shaken loose, the curls framing her meticulously made-up face. Even through the powder, you could tell that her skin was misted generously with freckles. She was incredibly striking, but her most curious feature was the multiple spells buzzing about her, humming close to her person. At first glance, they could have been cast by a witch, being well within the capabilities of someone who cast intuitively, but Reid recognized the anchors of structured magic. He was envious of the tremendous amount of control and skill. She was protected by a mass of wardings tucked somewhere on her person, which was no surprise considering she traveled the city alone as a woman. Tresport was his home, a glimmering city where the modern merged with classical, but he had lived here long enough to know it was wiser to travel the streets with caution. Reid protected himself through a similar number of wards, inscribed upon a cuff around his forearm beneath his sleeves, as was the typical fashion for practitioners of magic. He had inscribed the wards himself, pressured to learn the skill as he could not afford the proper services of a wardsmith, but she must have spent a fortune for a similar set. He could not believe he'd never seen her before. She was clearly well practiced in magic, and he doubted this was the first time she had needed the use of an apothecary. But if she had visited, he was sure he'd remember her. As she marched toward him, Reid sensed Mr. Gornoff still from across the room. "Good morning, miss. How can I help you today?" Reid said, attempting his best to muster the same easy smile he would for any other customer. "Hello, yes. Could I have a stock of Loffslow Reeds?" she asked with the certainty of a command. Reid could have sighed in relief. He loathed navigating customer confusion. His magic tended to flare up in tense situations, but even with the pressure of all eyes on him, he was sure this anomaly of a woman was nothing to worry about. She possessed a straightforwardness that promised a clear and timely interaction. He led her to the shelf of various dried herbs protruding from vases like flowers. "Your reeds are here, miss." Her gentle brown eyes instantly identified the stalks before snapping up to Reed's again. "I'm sorry," she said, though she did not seem very remorseful. "I meant fresh Loffslows. I was under the impression that this was a live apothecary, yes?" She hadn't specified live versus dried, and yet an undeserved wave of embarrassment came over Reid. She only looked at him expectantly, otherwise unaffected. "Yes, this is." He cleared his throat. "I can fetch you a live stock, but you're limited to 2. "Oh," she breathed, her brow pinching. "I need to distill the live essence of at least 4. I planned on purchasing 6. "I apologize, miss." Reid could not see Mr. Gornoff, but he sensed the buzz of his growing disappointment. "We do not carry many stocks of Loffslow and must ensure that there is ample supply to meet demand. If you return in another 2 weeks, we can sell you another 2. "That would defeat the point of it being a live ingredient, wouldn't it?" She cocked her head, and despite the circumstance, a small smile tugged at her lips. "I'm surprised you do not carry more. What do you make your pain relief paste out of, then?" Her question seemed born out of a true curiosity, but he couldn't help but feel as if he were being tested. Perhaps it was how her eyes glittered with the excitement of a challenge, or how she smiled as if she'd already won it. The chatter between Mr. Cunningham and Willie had quieted, yet the faint scratch of the journalist's pen against paper persisted. He knew if he answered, he'd fall into some sort of trap. But he had little other choice. "We've modified Helmer's recipe. Its active ingredient is lily seed." "Well," she began, counting on her fingers. "First, Vendry's method is far faster acting and simpler to produce. Second, it also works to relieve headaches brought on by barometric imbalances, which Helmer's method does not. Third, I know that lily seed is less expensive than Loffslow Reeds, but the cost is roughly the same when factoring how less active ingredient is required for the same potency of product." A distant howl of wind ripped along the waterfront, common for Tresport in the spring. Reed's fists clenched behind his back as he focused on maintaining control of his magic, temperamental in the face of the unpredictable. He fought to keep the smile on his face, but the woman had already dropped hers to focus on her argument, an argument he had no interest in engaging with. The operations of the apothecary were not up for debate with customers who thought they knew better. Against the rising swell of the annoyance in his chest, he chose his words carefully. The dried stalks she did not intend on purchasing might combust if she tested his patience any further. That is noted, miss. But as it stands, we do not currently produce that recipe. I cannot sell you your desired quantity of Lofslow, he replied with flat neutrality. She looked crestfallen, and a sudden puncture of regret deflated the tension from Reid's chest. Mr. Gornoff would not have been pleased, but perhaps it would have been better for both Reid and his customer if he'd complied with her request. His nerves soon rewound as Mr. Cunningham materialized beside them. "Excuse me, miss, but if you don't mind, before you leave, I would like to ask you a few questions." "Oh?" She stood a little straighter, and Reid thought it was a show of confidence until he realized she was attempting to peek over Mr. Cunningham's notepad and catch sight of what he'd written. "Do you work here as well?" "No, I'm a journalist. I'm working on an interest piece about this establishment." He turned a warm smile to the customer, and Reid recognized he was being politely dismissed. He had little choice but to bow out of the conversation, retreating to the counter beside Mr. Gornoff. The woman all but frowned at him as he left, a pull in his chest as something in her eyes seemed to beckon him to stay. He knew all too well how intimidating speaking to a journalist could be, but even beside her, he doubted his presence could have eased proceedings. And though he knew she did not deserve it, a small part of him wanted to see her embarrassed with the same audacity with which she had embarrassed him. "Well, I'm in no rush," she conceded. Mr. Cunningham's pen was poised at the ready. "Are you aware that this is the last live apothecary in the city?" She nodded. "Yes, that's why I came. My brother runs an apothecary in Summerford. I normally ask him to send anything I need, but you cannot post a live plant, I'm afraid." He nodded, continuing to scribble as he asked, "What were you going to use it for?" Almost indiscernibly, she stiffened. "A personal recipe. It isn't important," she shrugged, waving a distracting hand. "Apothecaries offer so many helpful services to the health and well-being of the community. My issues are trivial in comparison. I'm only a little inconvenienced that I was not able to purchase my stocks." He mirrored her timid smile. "Did you know I've been here for nearly an hour, and you've been the first person who's entered the shop?" The woman glanced at Reid, unsure. Reid felt just as stricken, ill-suited to answer her silent plea for guidance. The afternoon had wrought such stress. He had been funneling quite a bit of energy into suppressing a magical slip, much like holding his breath to prevent an accidental sound. Mr. Gornoff's jaw clenched in anticipation of the woman's answer. They had nothing to offer her but the worry written plain across their faces. She softened in sympathy. Facing Mr. Cunningham, she squared her shoulders. "In the spring, do you suffer from hay fever?" "Why, yes, I do." The journalist was enraptured by this change of pace and leaned forward. "It's not a terrible inconvenience, but one nonetheless." The apothecary staff's faces spelled confusion. Even Willie stood uselessly where Mr. Cunningham had parted ways with him following the exchange, with a furrowed brow. "I do suppose you've gone to a pharmacy to treat the issue, and they handed you a few little pills to treat the illness. They weren't very effective, were they?" she asked. He shook his head. "That is because they're developed to suppress the symptoms. An apothecary is much more apt at treating the root of an issue. You're allergic to the pollens that are released into the air every spring. An apothecarist uses local honey made from the same pollens, mixes it with a few other ingredients, and brews a tonic that soothes your reaction." Then, as if she had visited the store 1,000 times before, the woman strode to the tonic she had described on a display near the medicinal remedies. She must have sensed for it or cast some sort of location spell, but Reid had detected neither. Her magic was too neat, too small and controlled. almost illegible. As she approached the bottle, her heels clicked against the hardwood. She picked the tonic up with fingers adorned by a ruby polish before offering it to the journalist. He turned the bottle over, feeling the liquid roll inside and scanning the scant description in Willie's handwriting on its label. My, that is interesting. If the treatments here are more effective than those at the pharmacy, why do you think no one seeks them? It depends on the treatment, she explained, her hands making circles in emphasis. People do like convenience, so why bother with an apothecary when a tiny pill of paracetamol will get things in working order? It's simple and reliable. Another treatment could solve the issue, but the quick one is good enough to let you return to your life. She seemed as if she had more to say, but in the pause between sentences, Mr. Cunningham asked, "Don't you think it has anything to do with the Woolsworth fire of 1902? Reid winced. This was the question Mr. Gornoff had been dreading. Neither he nor Willie had been confronted with it, but clearly Mr. Cunningham had been biding his time and saw his opportunity in this far more articulate woman. She faltered, her face falling, but she recovered quickly. No matter how recently she had arrived to the city, she practiced magic, so she was sure to have felt the lasting social effects of the fire. In 1902, the Woolsworth shoemaking factory 3 blocks from the apothecary caught fire, and 57 people died. Per survivor accounts, the cause had been a young witch. Some said she had attempted to operate machinery with magic. Some said simple exhaustion let her magic slip out of control. Since then, the people of Tresport had lost faith in intuitive and low magics. Anything with pagan roots or that lacked the reliability of standardization. Universities lent legitimacy to some of the old practices, but many were pressured to choose between industry and magic, doctor or healer, pharmacist or apothecarist. Second sense wards, assurance that the wearer's magic was locked away and under control, were now a requirement when working at any of the factories in the city, and rarely foregone in public. If Reid could wear a second sense ward, he would. But everyone's magic manifested differently, and his refused to be bottled away. He loathed hearing about the fire, a reminder of how people would think of him if he ever lost himself, but he managed to keep his reaction tempered as the woman before him considered her response to the reporter. "I think the fire certainly has colored people's perceptions," she said diplomatically, though the end of the sentence strained with a yearning to be continued. Everyone stared at her as she considered it, and even Mr. Cunningham's pen halted mid-air as he waited for her. Finally, she spoke. "But I believe it's a misguided fear." Mr. Gornoff's magic quirked with a curiosity mirroring Mr. Cunningham's. "Oh?" The woman nodded, surer of herself now that she knew he would listen. "The real problem was never the magic. Magic or no magic. Fires and malfunctions are an inevitability within a factory. Magic did not lock people within or neglect to provide adequate exits in case of an emergency. The carelessness of the company and its management killed those people. Magic is an inevitability of our lives. It's in everything, and to understand it is to understand ourselves." The mood was somber after she finished, as if no one could quite share such a pragmatic mindset, although they wanted to. Reid did. Something personal, possibly familiar, tugged deep within him, but he dismissed it, refusing to follow his thoughts as they veered from the present. Mr. Gornoff, however, responded to her answer with a hum and a pleased radiance. Reid swallowed his jealousy. Mr. Gornoff had never spared him such a smile. Still, the woman was not entirely out of the woods. Mr. Cunningham could question her about the Protect Our Workers organization, and she was none the wiser when it came to the destruction they attempted to inflict on the apothecary. "That's an interesting perspective," Mr. Cunningham said as he recorded it on his notepad. "What do you think it would take for people to return to the apothecaries?" "People must realize that caring for yourself, connecting with yourself, is not an indulgence," she insisted. "Your well-being, your wholeness of person, should be a priority, not an afterthought." He wondered if she would bring up the POWO, but then her entire countenance shifted as she broke into the smile of a saleswoman. "It's also an issue of awareness. People don't know the range of services an apothecary offers or have any interest in browsing their goods. They only come inside when they seek something specific." Mr. Cunningham wagged a good-natured but accusatory finger at her as levity returned to the room. "Why, you did the same thing 2 minutes ago." "Yes," she admitted. "I am guilty of this, though, to be fair, the apothecarist I spoke with would have done well to refer me to an acceptable substitution for my spell. At the very least, he could have assisted in guiding me to any other products in stock that could have served me well. Each apothecary has a different array of formulations they have developed over the years. I visited a number of international apothecaries, and I actually do enjoy how pushy their apothecarists are, as if they're salespeople. I picked up a wonderful hair oil from Zhang's apothecary in the Han district, which I would have never thought to look for if the apothecarist had not recommended it to me." Somehow, the reminder of Reid's incompetency had returned. He frowned, his annoyance reignited, not bothering to conceal his displeasure any longer. He smelled smoke, but as long as nothing caught fire, he didn't much care. Her shiny curls did appear to be wonderfully maintained, and Reid had no doubt the oil from Zhang's played a significant role in its success. But Gornoff's apothecary did not produce such a hair oil, and as an apothecarist, it was not his responsibility to appeal to customers' vanities to make superfluous sales. "Miss, I will get you 6 bundles of stocks," Mr. Gornoff called out from beside Reid, startling him. Then his employer discreetly whispered out of the side of his mouth, "Go fetch them." When Reid stalled in stunned confusion, he added through gritted teeth, "Now." The woman glanced toward the counter as Reid slipped away to the greenhouse. Not wishing to miss any of Mr. Gornoff's conversation with the woman, he hastened his steps. As he scrambled to the mouth of the airy and bright greenhouse, he could not spare a second to admire the sharp fragrance. He summoned the stalks with a yank of magic, and they divorced from their stems with a satisfying snap before hurtling across the room into his outstretched palm. Normally, Reid would harvest the live ingredient by hand, but he was short of temper and time. It was not common for apothecarists to wield magic so flippantly, and he did not plan to make a habit of it, but he needed a release from the pressure that had built around his temples. Reid hurried to return. "A job?" the woman at the counter asked, dumbstruck. Reid almost dropped the stalks. Mr. Cunningham seemed delighted by this course of events. Mr. Gornoff's nod accompanied a wide grin. "You are clearly capable and a forward thinker. Mr. Cunningham, how much of the article will be composed of her testimony?" He did not have to rake over his notes to answer. "Approximately half. I will admit, she's the most interesting thing that's happened all day." She had been the most memorable thing to grace the apothecary in the last few months, actually, but Reid felt no need to admit it. "Precisely." Mr. Gornoff gave an animated snap of his fingers. "And so, when people read it, I want to be able to provide the experience they expect. If that is to happen, we need you, Miss Pinova," she replied, thrusting forward her hand so he could shake it. "Josephine Pinova. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Pinova. I am Mr. Gornoff, Ivan Gornoff." He shook her enthusiastic hand. Reid slid behind his employer placing the stocks on the counter between them. "This is my associate, Mr. Reid." Josephine Pinova's hand was unbelievably warm in his. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm with assuredness. He did not attempt to match her intensity, preferring to keep his handshakes mellow out of politeness. Her keen eyes glinted victoriously, though, at his expense. Reid detested being made to feel inadequate. He had enough of it already with Mr. Gornoff's cool moods and the empty shop. Hopefully, this would not become a habit of Miss Pinova's, but their first meeting did not imbue him with any degree of confidence to the contrary. Making every attempt to mask his apprehension, Reid chose his words carefully. "I hope, if you accept this position, you will meet the expectations of my employer." Said employer elbowed him behind the counter, though Mr. Gornoff still clarified, "You will be hired under a probationary period. After the course of 4 months, if you prove your capability in sales, we will be able to offer you a permanent position. Do you think that would be acceptable?" 4 months. July. Reid realized with an inkling of horror their 5-month deadline had been shortened. A new hire meant another cost. She had stolen a month from the store. Anyone else in the world would have hesitated to take the offer, at least for a moment. Reid himself would have asked for a day to consider it, but Josephine Pinova only beamed, nodded her head emphatically, and promised, "You can count on me." Mr. Gornoff clasped his hands in satisfaction, perhaps more satisfaction than Reid had seen from him in months, even with the clipped timeline to meet their sales goal. Reid's frustration returned. He was not prone to blushing, though if his lack of luck continued, his ears were sure to turn red. "One more thing," Mr. Gornoff said, leaning forward conspiratorially so that Mr. Cunningham could not hear. Miss Pinova leaned forward as well. "Are you Baptian?" Her face flashed with surprise, and her eyes darted from the fish symbol hanging above the door to the back room. She was sure to falter. Reid had never seen the question of faith raised during an interview, but Mr. Gornoff had just met the girl and perhaps was attempting a quick judge of character. Mr. Gornoff was Baptian, as were his family who established the apothecary. They were herbalists from Balkra, with the belief that magic was a gift from God that was to be celebrated in the miracles nature provided. They had little interest in spells or hexes or physical magics, though some Baptians did consider the physicalities a practice worth exploring with God by their side. Mr. Gornoff's wife had been such a Baptian. Pinova was a pagan name. Some weeks ago, Reid had cross-referenced an appendix of pagan names with practicing magical families in the state in hopes of soliciting more patrons to the shop. It was a waste of energy, as pagan families did not part with their long-standing traditions, and the apothecary was clearly not already a part of their practice. Josephine had come from such a family, no doubt one of the low-magic pagans, and she had the surname to match. Surely she was not Baptian. "The Lord as my Savior, blessed be his will and his hands that heal," she replied. Reid must have heard that line dozens of times during uncomfortably long Sunday morning church sermons. He gaped at her. Mr. Gornoff beamed. "The job is yours, my dear." Miss Pinova nearly squealed in delight, her magic buzzing about her manically, but she made a great show of subduing her excitement. "Thank you," she said, her smile sticky with an artificial sweetness as she fixed her eyes on Reid, her new co-worker. Her gaze fell to the lumpy bundle he gripped like a vice. "Unfortunately, I will no longer be needing those stocks." October 30th, 1905. Dear Miss Davis, thank you for your advice with scrying. I possessed my doubts, but it worked. I set my gaze upon the shimmering koi fish in Vinmaria Park from miles away. After my success, I thought to scry you, only to find a warding blocking the vision. I apologize for prying, but truthfully, I had thought you were a man until your most recent letter. I should not be so quick with my assumptions, and I believe there is no harm in centering my bearings before attempting another correspondence. But I see that you respect your privacy, and I apologize for attempting to intrude. As for your request, the answer is quite simple. It lies not in the metal, but with the final finish of the glasses. From your goal, I assume you've chosen an iron alloy, as those are the best for conducting seeking spells. To transfer its properties to the glass, you must heat the entire object over a fire lit with golania. It only lasts for a day, maybe two, before you must reactivate the magic. You do not need a smith's mill. I pour my own candles with golania wicks to attempt similar small-scale magics. In the future, I would be happy to answer any questions you have regarding metal alchemy. I'm no smith, but I do find the study fascinating. Machinery is becoming increasingly advanced, but new technology is divorcing itself from old practices. Imagine if we could make magic as reliable and controlled as machines are. Most people never discover their potential with magic as the study is too tedious, but we are moving in a direction where one day they could tap into their natural aptitude with reliable effectiveness. The advancements in our ability to scale the creation of enchanted objects is extremely exciting, which is why I'm so drawn to the Institute. If you do not mind, I must ask why you feel a desire to attend. You mentioned that you have little intuition for magic, to my shock. I thought all admits studying high magics were those taking advantage of a natural aptitude. I know that it's possible to study structured magic with little intuition, but I can't imagine why someone would put themselves through such a difficulty. Especially as a woman, I assume it is no small feat to persevere down the path of structured magics, and I applaud your tenacity. Sincerely, Mr. Clark.
Chapter 5. Josephine Pinova, April 16th, 1906. The explosion was an accident. Yet when greeted with the flash and the bang, Josie's first concern was not for her life, but for her livelihood, if she was to be blamed. She could not afford to be fired again. It was not the first delivery Josie had opened at the apothecary. After 3 weeks at the shop, it was already far above the dozenth or perhaps even the second dozenth. Josie had sliced into the unsuspecting brown parcel the same way she had sliced into any other. Then there was a bright white light and a very loud crack, and Josie was convinced she'd blown up the shop and lost her job. But when her eyes could see again and her ears could hear, she was still in the back room. The lights hadn't even gone out. The only evidence of the blast was the smoke suspended in the air, the crumpled remains of a brown package that had been whole mere moments ago, and the blood welling from a slice across her left palm. Josie stood dumbfounded in the woozy silence.
What was that?
Mr. Reid arrived to the scene of the crime so quickly he seemed to materialize from the doorway. His typically stern expression was not tilted in the slightest, but refined into a sharp concentration. His features never failed to captivate her attention, and now, dazed, they were all she could focus on. Upon their introduction, the first thing that had struck her was that he was tall, almost gangly, but not quite. The next was the white stripe in his aggressively gelled black hair. The third, it was difficult to discern his origins from his face. Most residents of the state of Ketchineppie were white, and though he was less pale than most, she could not be sure if his complexion was due to a tan or his genetic baseline. She leaned toward the latter assumption when regarding his aquiline nose and hooded eyes. None of these features alone conveyed foreign origins, but she suspected this was the case by the certain way that they came together across his angled face. He was uniquely singular, almost stunning, if not for how often a frown painted his features. He was frowning at her now, though this time it was for good reason. She just had triggered an explosion. By way of explanation, Josie pointed at the now amorphous and crumpled parcel. It blew up. Mr. Goranov entered then, and the dust suspended in the stale air triggered a fit of coughing. Mr. Reid spoke louder to compensate for the interruption, an edge of horror to his voice.
Are you bleeding?
Josie hadn't realized she'd pointed with her injured hand. The initial shock was wearing off, and the cut began to throb. She laid out her palm to better inspect the gash. I must have cut myself with the utility knife when the package went off. I should be fine. She should have been looking for something to wrap her wound with, but her first concern was seeming composed so she could keep her position. Explosions aside, Mr. Goranov had been pleased with Josie's development within her first few weeks. The article had attracted a few curious customers, and she sent them home with more paper-wrapped parcels than anticipated. But it was impossible to change the shop's luck overnight. They were doing better than they had in the past month, though perpetually a few infuriating dollars short of their weekly goals. Her family owned an apothecary, but she had never been allowed to work within it, and she did not want to lose her opportunity here. Due to her shortcomings as a witch, Josie once considered that perhaps she was better suited to be an apothecarist. But in her family, and many families like hers, the women sensed and diagnosed, sometimes concocting elixirs, but when the practice veered too far into science, it was considered men's work. Some even still believed in the truth of magical hysteria, that women would go mad in an attempt to comprehend structured magic beyond their natural inclinations. At the moment, Josie was doing her best to not seem too hysterical, though she could not help but lean on the mixing station for support. Mr. Goranov's coughing had finally ceased, and he now stood beside Reid.
Great Lord above, what is in the air?
The answer seemed obvious to Josie, but after a moment's hesitation, she realized the fog did have a peculiar moss-like color, and a peculiar odor. It did not burn her nose, but it coated the back of her throat, earthy and bitter, like a green tea that had been left to seep on the stove too long.
It's a pesticide,
Mr. Reid answered, covering his mouth with the back of his hand. He must have garnered the information from his second sense, but it was sometimes difficult for Josie to sense how far his magic extended, even when her head was not ringing from the bang of an explosion. Though she was familiar with apothecarists refusing a second sense ward, her brother did not wear one, Mr. Reid's magic was unlike anything she was accustomed to. It melded into the potent magic of the shop, nearly indistinguishable, and its movements seemed reflexive, so naturalistic and minute she could rarely detect them. The only exception was when his mood warped. A pesticide, Josie repeated. Why would anyone send a pesticide bomb? Mr. Reid stared quite pointedly at Mr. Goranov. The old man sobered, mustered a reassuring tone, and explained.
The Protect Our Workers organization has been attempting to put us out of business for some time now. The back room is reinforced in case of accidents, so this mishap should not be so difficult to contain. All in all, there was no harm done.
It was very unfortunate to learn that she'd just become the target of a hate group. But in that moment, Josie could only feel relief that she was not being blamed for the incident. Mr. Reid's frown deepened.
Ms. Pinova's been injured.
He gestured to her still bleeding hand. His baritone voice was much like his magic, smooth and powerful, and so impossibly antithetical to his temperament. Mr. Goranov looked at him expectantly.
Well, take care of it.
Mr. Reid's lips flattened into a thin line, and he took special care not to look at Josie as he gestured for her hand. Even so, the weight of his attention was unexpectedly heavy on her bearing, forcing her to avert her gaze as she offered up her palm. He took it gingerly, cupping it in his right hand as the nimble fingers on his left hovered above her gash, which was quickly becoming a mess. As he inspected her injury, the tender, cool thrum of his magic washed over her wound, and she let her hand relax in his. This was familiar. The healing magic crackling just beneath his skin was so similar to that of her mother's. She wondered who had taught him how to heal, as it was not a skill afforded by an apothecary's apprenticeship.
She needs to see a doctor, Mage.
He diagnosed, but he did not drop her hand. Instead, he seemed to produce a strip of cotton cloth from thin air with a flourish and wrap it about her palm. his hands moving with a gentle precision. Though he did not hurt her, she held her breath as he worked.
I think the pesticide may be enchanted. If that's the case, it could be dangerous to heal anything lingering in her cut. It must be magically sterilized first.
Josie knew very well how to magically sterilize a wound. She had done it on behest of her mother many times before. A quick flourish of magic after dressing the wound with a simple poultice. It was straightforward. If only she could recall the specifics of the procedure, which she found very difficult to do at that very moment. Perhaps it was the shock, perhaps it was the pain, but she remained silent as Reid released her hand. When confronted with the severity of the situation, Mr. Goronov's determined demeanor thawed, ever so slightly.
Is it truly that bad? Hopefully not so bad, but it must be properly examined so we can be sure.
Mr. Reid pinned Mr. Goronov with a hard look, and something Josie could not read passed between them.
It could have very easily been much worse. This can't happen again.
Mr. Goronov's disposition hardened. Josie was beginning to feel suffocated. She did not know if it was a byproduct of breathing in the pesticide or if she was still in shock, but she needed to get away from the back room. I think I should get going to the doctor, then. Mr. Reid still did not look at her face.
You need someone to take you.
My sister can. Josie rubbed soothing circles into the wrist of her afflicted hand. My apartment is not too far from here, and she's home. I can...
No. She won't know what to tell the doctor, and Willie's out on an errand.
He interrupted before turning to offer Mr. Goronov a reluctant look.
I'll take her.
If Josie had expected an outing would finally properly acquaint her with Mr. Reid, she was sorely mistaken. The nearest hospital was an extension of the university, and they made the walk in uncomfortable silence. It was warm for an April morning, but she still pulled her coat around her as tightly as possible. The farther they traveled from the vortex the apothecary sat upon, the more tired she felt. After a few failed attempts at conversation with Mr. Reid, she funneled all her myopic focus onto the sidewalk before her, concentrating on one step in front of the other, doing her best to ignore the growing pain of her injury. She had never walked from the apothecary to the university, and by the time they arrived, she did not think she could retrace her steps if she tried. Perhaps there was something to Mr. Reid's concerns of a magical infection, because as they were led behind a privacy curtain, Josie realized she was feeling quite unwell. Her headache had intensified, matching the incessant pounding of her hand. Nausea tickled the back of her throat, and she took a hurried seat on the cot in an attempt to settle her stomach. She was terrified of vomiting in front of her coworker. Though if she did, she couldn't imagine Mr. Reid's expression faltering very much. He remained stern-faced as he stood beside the cot and recounted the details of the incident to the healer nurse. "And how long was the wound exposed to the pesticide?" asked the healer nurse, dressed all in white with her silver hair pulled back into a practical bun beneath her cap. She wore a copper pin on her smock to reflect her station as a healer who also had technical medical training, a plus symbol embedded within a 6-pointed star. Mr. Reid looked only at the healer nurse as he answered her questions.
Between 2 to 4 minutes. It was only treated after some insistence.
The healer nurse turned her stern green gaze onto Josie and addressed her for the first time during the interaction. Both she and Mr. Reid looked down at her on the cot, and between his height and her countenance, she felt very small. "In the future, miss, you can't ignore the issue. It's imperative that you treat the wound as fast as possible." Josie had thought herself to be perfectly reasonable throughout the whole ordeal. She had not become upset over becoming victim of a targeted hate crime. She had kept her wits about her after the explosion. She had not made a fuss about her injury. And yet, she was still being blamed. She was in no mood to be spoken down to, but beyond everything, she was tired. Josie swallowed her curt retort and nodded. The faster she complied, the sooner she could leave. The healer nurse mirrored her nod. "Good. The doctor mage will be with you shortly." As the click of her heels against the wooden floor signaled her departure, the threat of another uncomfortable silence loomed between her and Mr. Reid. She didn't think she could bear it any longer. When the doctor mage comes, let me speak to him. I'm sure I can give a more accurate summary of events.
Oh?
He raised an eyebrow, finally turning to face her.
Was I inaccurate in some way?
She managed to keep her voice level as she clutched her bloody hand. You did blame me for my injury. He slowly crossed his arms as his eyes roamed her from head to toe. Reacquainted with the weight of his gaze, her cheeks flushed.
Miss Pinova,
he said, slow, impatient, and condescending all at once.
I simply recounted what happened.
It took everything in her to keep from snapping, and I'm simply pointing out how it may be biased. He remained composed, but his magic flickered.
Biased?
She had no patience for feigned ignorance. Mr. Reid, is there anything I did to displease you? She attempted the question as nicely as she could, if only for the sake of civility, but she was sure he'd find some malice behind it. If so, feel free to raise the issue so we may put it behind us. The suggestion pierced his veil of impassivity. He stood straighter, squaring his shoulders with a determined air. Then he pronounced,
I knew you lied about being Baptian when you were hired.
Josie refrained from glaring in response. This must have been an accusation born from petty grievance. Perhaps she should have been more conscientious of her tongue in front of the journalist, but she had never imagined he would hold such a grudge. Who are you to tell me if I am or am not Baptian? Without flinching, he replied as if he had a moral obligation to do so.
Your last name is Pinova.
Evidently, something about her rang fundamentally ungodlike. Perhaps it was how she refused to seem as small as she was, or how she wore her makeup. Whatever it was, he had found it so contradictory to the practices of the religion, he had brought it upon himself to decode the origin of her name and confirm his suspicions. Ah, so it is. How very observant. She offered him a sharp smile, though her heart beat furiously. Mr. Reid was her superior, and his opinion was held in high esteem by Mr. Goranov, and she did not want this situation to spiral from her control. And tell me, why should my religion be of any importance to you? The last time I checked, it is a private matter between God and myself. He refused to be swayed.
Where do you attend Mass?
You wouldn't know of the church. Despite his stony expression, the wispy pressure of his magic built like steam from a kettle about to whistle. She could not typically associate mood to magic, but it was abundantly clear he was frustrated.
Now I'm sure you must be lying,
he said. She could not stand a righteous man. Was it necessary to lie to secure the position? Josie asked, as sincere as she was calculating. Mr. Goranov was religious. Mr. Reid clearly was as well. But Willie did not seem so, though he was the sort to be assumed Baptian. The question as to her own faith had caught her off guard. Since Mr. Reid attempted a moral argument, she decided she would appeal to his moral sensibilities. Hearing the shuffle of nurses escorting patients to their neighboring cots, she was careful to keep her volume to a hiss. If I was not Baptian, and I had admitted so, would I have been turned away? The scriptures say to love one another without discrimination, so my faith should not have made a difference. But if it does make a serious difference, please, I'd like to know. Mr. Reid gritted his teeth, but matched her volume rather than raise his voice.
It should not make a difference.
She raised an eyebrow. But would it have?
Did you lie to him?
He stared at her as if his brown eyes alone could coax the truth from her. They could not. Is lying a sin? Perhaps it is, but necessitating such a lie would be the bigger sin of the two. She would make some gesture for emphasis if her hand did not hurt so much. And your insistence about all of this conveys that it was quite necessary. Shouldn't God be the only judge of our decisions? There was a long stretch of silence before Mr. Reid broke his gaze, staring at a knot in the hardwood floor.
I suppose it does not matter.
And that is how the doctor mage found them. Mr. Reid's face turned toward the ground, and Josie suppressing a victorious smile. As the doctor began his inspection and prattle of questions, Josie's eyes locked onto his golden mage's pin, the six-pointed star and cross, and quietly hoped he would not prescribe a treatment administered by the same unpleasant healer nurse from earlier. Unfortunately, the healer nurse did return, treatment in hand. The poultice's tingle of magic was as cool as the paste itself, but the healer nurse's magic was the prickle of pins and needles. If the doctor had simply recommended the specific poultice, Josie might have been able to purchase it elsewhere and figure out the healing magic herself. Instead, she had been forced to pay for a poultice cobbled together from the university's apothecary. Josie wondered, absent-mindedly, just how many patients at Dr. Mage's offices around the city defaulted to buying overpriced treatments from the university. And then she realized that the shop might give patients another option. Perhaps a hospital like this was the place where an advertisement for Mr. Goronoff's apothecary would be the most valuable. November 3rd, 1905. Dear Mr. Clark, thank you for your honesty. Although I am no man, you are one of the better ones, as I have met many men, and none would be as honest with their intentions as you. You are very sincere, and I do consider myself a fair judge of character. If I am being honest, I did try to scry for you as well. It seems we were both unsuccessful, yet understand each other perfectly. I apologize for the lengthy reply. It is perhaps more honest than I would like to be. This is how I found myself applying to the University of Tresport Institute of Magic. I was raised in a family where magic was love, and love was magic. It was not that my family refused to love something without magic, but they simply could not fathom how. I was a baby who could hear her mother's lullaby but never understand it. Do not be mistaken, I do have some second sense. I had a bit of an ear, but I could not learn my mother's song by listening to her tune. So while my cousins and my siblings learned to summon objects or to light their way by example, I had no such talent. One of my earliest memories is of attempting to play with my older cousins. They were going around the garden, seeing what the biggest object was that they were capable of freezing, and I stood uselessly on the sidelines, as I could not fathom how they were accomplishing the feat. I watched as a whisper of magic wrapped itself around a dandelion, climbing up its stems and crystallizing its small tufts. But though I could see it, though I could sense it, as hard as I tried, I could not replicate it. You would think that I would come to resent magic, but I could not. It was a member of my family, and so I had no choice but to love it, in the same way I would an uncle. When I learned that magic could be deconstructed into a spell and cast through understanding its mechanics, my life changed. I was a quick study and one who was determined to become a peer to her peers. And I did. Soon, from an outsider's perspective, my magic was no different than that of the rest of my family. But as they pushed and pulled with whims, I recited spells quickly under my breath. My love for magic changed as I uncovered its complexities, like gaining a new appreciation for sugar after watching how it can transform to a rich caramel. It was no longer something unconditional and banal, but something to chase, like the thrill of locking eyes with someone beautiful across the room. Intuitive magic only extends to the low magics, and I started with studying practiced, structured low magics, but as early as secondary school, I began to dip my toes into the high magics. It was no longer attempting to compensate for something commonplace that I did not possess, but aspiring towards something new and exciting. It is not typical for women to study magic in this capacity. We are often relegated to the low magics, what we are able to instinctually handle. It is a pity that so many are discouraged from discovering a love such as mine. You know of the feats of Ms. Rebecca Lagrange. I must have read her biography a dozen times. Studying at a university had only seemed a fantasy until I learned she had done it and conquered history. Now that I know it is achievable, I have no choice but to achieve it. I have never spelled out my life story such as this. It would be terribly embarrassing if I ever explained this aloud. But by writing it here, I instead contain a great deal of unfiltered relief. I have waited my entire life for the chance to be honest, and you have extended me the perfect opportunity. I know that you are real, You must be, and yet you do not seem entirely so. It is so easy over pen and paper to focus on our similarities and disregard where we may misalign. I ask then, why you have chosen university? It is a brutal undertaking without the resources to study correctly, and considering our squabbles over a library book, it seems we are trapped in similar cages. Your friend, Ms. Davis.
Chapter 6. Aufidius Reid, April 20th, 1906. Exiting the greenhouse and rounding the corner to the front, Reid saw Mr. Gornoff and Miss Pinova engaged in eager discussion behind the counter. Reid froze as he debated whether to backtrack into the greenhouse, hoping he hadn't been spotted, or to duck his head and scurry into the back room, hoping they would not acknowledge him. With a limited tolerance for bickering, he did not think he could afford a run-in with Miss Pinova after already having made plans to visit the racetrack with Felipe after work. He regretted not sensing if she was in the front before heading that way, though there was not much to be done with regard to avoiding her, especially after she'd nearly blown up half the shop nearly 2 weeks ago. He had elected to keep a closer eye on her. Miss Pinova was a being, he hypothesized, specifically designed to torture him. She was never short of a biting remark and always armed with a never-ending supply of questions, the answers to which she never liked. Her frown was inevitable, and when it arrived, as much as he fought against the sensation, he would feel an uncomfortable twist in his gut. Today, her unassuming and petite frame was clothed in a ruffled shirtwaist, cinched at the waist by a flattering sage-green skirt. He surveyed her for a beat too long, and before he had decided whether to retreat or bear his chances, Mr. Gornoff beckoned him with a wave. He approached the counter with reluctance. "Yes, sir," he asked, forcing a professional expression as he addressed Mr. Gornoff and only Mr. Gornoff. His white and whittled fingers carefully handed over a cool jar of a curious, blush-pink liquid as Miss Pinova watched with astute, almost nervous interest. Reid did his best to ignore her, scrutinizing the jar as it caught the rays of midday sun. "What is this?" Reid asked as he removed the lid. The scent of rose mingled with the frankincense and sage of the store, but he was able to detect the subdued notes of its active ingredient. A pleasant sensation washed over him, and his anxieties at standing there between Josephine and Gornoff all but vanished. He suddenly felt as if he was sitting on a rooftop during a velvet summer sunset, the air heavy and quiet. "Soothing elixir," Miss Pinova replied, and for the briefest of seconds, her voice was the loveliest sound in the world. Reid snapped the lid back on the jar and blinked away any remaining drowsiness. The base is Vamia root? He could vaguely sense the substance, its frequency low and balmy, but its sweet, rich scent was what gave it away. Josie nodded, looking pleased with herself. Reid couldn't imagine what for. He had identified it. He was the one Mr. Gornoff was testing. "Miss Pinova believes this soothing elixir would be a good addition to the shelves," Mr. Gornoff explained, nowhere near as enthusiastic as she was. "Customers could use it on its own or dissolved into a bath." It was clear the owner of the apothecary did not want to stock the product. If he had, he would have approved the request at once, but he was searching for an apt justification with which to deny Miss Pinova, and he was placing Reid in the position of being the bearer of bad news. "I suspect it's an effective product," Reid said, and Miss Pinova's face brightened. Vamia root was a tricky ingredient to utilize correctly, and it was clever how Miss Pinova had managed to distill it with no training whatsoever. Still, he set the jar on the counter. "But it's not right for the apothecary." She looked as if she wished to say something, to argue with him, but Mr. Gornoff spoke first. Why not? Vamia root does not have long-term shelf stability, Reid replied, carefully considering each word. In the brief time they had been talking, he had sensed the elixir's magic waning. The decrease was slight, but he was certain it would lose potency before it had the chance to be sold, and then the customer was unlikely to finish the vial before it became useless. It's expensive as well. The risk is too high for a product we do not yet know if we can sell. We have 4 months left to get into the black and have not begun to turn enough profit to justify adding more stock to already full shelves. I can sell it, Miss Pinova rushed to interject, but Mr. Gornoff had made up his mind. I apologize, my dear. Perhaps next time you'll have better luck. Regret sullied his expression as he caught sight of Josie's disappointment. He lifted the elixir from the counter, but as his eyes slipped from the jar to Reid, he soured considerably. Though, as always, the effort is appreciated. Reid hated the racetrack. He hated the barking of rowdy conversation, the distant smell of mud and excrement, how his legs were forced to fold between the cramped rows. Nearly everyone wore second-sense wards, but the patrons' collective gambling anxiety was potent enough to leak through and infuse the air with a terrible, frenetic hum. Reid hated that due to gambling laws, he and Felipe were forced to make the trek outside city limits to one of the illegal tracks owned by some crime family or organization. Felipe was banned from a fair number of them, and Reid did not know who owned this one, but its location was more troublesome than Felipe's previous haunt, the Scontilis track. Reid had become roped up in running messages for them when he was a child, precisely because of their proximity. But it had been some time since then. Reid's crimes now began and ended with witnessing Felipe participate in illegal sports betting, and today he coped by complaining all the while of Miss Pinova. Even when I'm correct, she does her best to make me feel as if I'm wrong, Reid grumbled, eyes focused on the pocket watch he was taking apart in his lap in an attempt to drown out the incessant ringing about him. He yearned for his tidy desk at home, his metalworking and engraving tools lined up neatly along one side, small drawers organizing and storing common parts lined against the back, and metal filings swept away from the center as quickly as they accumulated. But Felipe had invited him to the racetrack tonight, and Reid had little choice but to accompany him and ensure he didn't gamble away more than he intended. Felipe's eyes remained fixed on his horse of choice, a spotted Appaloosa named Marigold Glory, as it sprinted across the track. You're mad she's smarter than you are? I'm mad she thinks she's smarter than me. Sometimes she even asks me questions to which she already knows the answer just to see if I do as well. Reid knew Felipe was not listening, but nevertheless launched into an anecdote detailing how Miss Pinova had noticed that the cleansing balms were beginning to sour and proved her hypothesis by seeing if they would sink in tear-treated brine. Reid had never heard of the test, but she had cited her sources, which were outlined in the footnote of an appendix in the Apothecarist's Index on page 1257. Obviously, she was knowledgeable, but he did not know why it was her life's mission to make him feel less so. Felipe did not respond to a single word. He didn't react to anything at all until Marigold Glory placed 6th 3 times in a row, and he officially dipped into the red. With the final call, Felipe gave a loud groan and leaned back entirely in his chair. Very unfortunate, Reid said with a careful flatness, briefly glancing up from his work with the pocket watch. Felipe's misfortune today had acted in Reid's favor, though he could not seem too relieved in the face of Felipe's disappointment. Per the budget Reid and Sam had set for him, Felipe had just reached his limit for the next 3 months. Sam had been asking for weeks that Reid accompany him to the tailor, and now that Felipe would no longer ask him out to the racetrack, he would have the time. Reid adjusted his magnifying spectacle before he turned back to his project, screwdriver between his fingers. "I'm almost finished with your alarm, though. Give me a few minutes and then we can leave." He enchanted the pocket watch to vibrate at a certain hour, able to wake its owner for work without disturbing anyone else. It had taken him longer than he would have liked to figure out the enchantment, and he had asked Miss Davis for her advice. The necessary runes at first seemed too numerous to inscribe on the pocket watch, but she had found a clever way to condense them. Felipe attempted to take advantage of Reid's distraction by slipping out of his seat. Reid didn't know where he thought he was going, but without looking up, he spelled Felipe's crinkled leather boots to the dusty floor. Having designed Felipe's wards, Reid knew his way around them. He was prepared for Felipe to try at his laces to escape from his shoes, but after a small yelp of protest, Felipe accepted defeat with a haughty cross of his arms. "Why must I suffer?" Felipe whined. "You couldn't have done a little magic trick earlier to save me from striking out this bad?" Reid snorted. Magically tampering with a race was a very serious infraction, so much so that they didn't dare attempt it even when they were younger and much more reckless. If you could see the shielding around the track, you wouldn't ask. With every visit to the racetracks, the shielding spells became more impressive, an invisible crackling dome around the track. Doubtless, it was the design of a team of mages specializing in warding at a private company that charged annually for a top-of-the-line update. "It's always an excuse with you," Felipe huffed as Reid began to reassemble the pocket watch. "Did you only agree to come to see me at my lowest?" Debt would never be Felipe's lowest. In fact, Reid spent the better part of his life ensuring Felipe never returned to his lowest. Both he and Felipe knew that he would endure any number of terrible nights at the racetrack, would endure anything for Felipe, because Reid owed Felipe a life debt. Reid had been cast onto the streets when he was 8, and it was not long before he contracted polio. By the time Felipe found him, Reid was convinced he would soon reunite with his recently deceased mother. Shivering, hungry, and sick, he had holed himself in a drafty corner of an infrequently visited warehouse, from which Felipe happened to be in the process of thieving. Delirious, and with a rudimentary understanding of what a will and testament was, Reid had offered him the last of his possessions, which at the time amounted to a nickel in his pocket. He did not consider his mother's earrings to be included, as he fully and naively intended to be buried with them. Felipe Delgado took the nickel. He also saved Reid's life. Felipe had always been short of breath, an outcome of his own battle with polio a year earlier, but talked unceasingly. Reid never quite regained control of his right hand, and he was morose about it until Felipe pointed out bluntly, "Would you rather be dead or have that hand? Because I'm just glad I'm breathing at all." It would be a few months until Reid had an answer for him. He had been yanked from his deathbed and nursed back to health by Felipe and his friends, Sam, John, and Allie, in an abandoned basement. They had asked him approximately 1,000,000 times why he hadn't gone to a hospital, but Reid refused to explain. The truth was that he was terrified of the place, but he chose to seem difficult and irrational. His mother had always said if he had a magical outburst around others, they might take him away to a sanatorium. To a deathly ill and chronically fearful 8-year-old, a hospital and a sanatorium seemed one and the same. Reid exited Felipe's world when he was 13, after he started his apprenticeship at the apothecary, but he could never leave him behind. During his apprenticeship, Reid would pass off what little of his stipend he could spare to Felipe and the others, and if he was caught, he'd both hear an earful and earn a deduction in next week's paycheck. It still had not stopped him. They had no intention of forgetting Felipe either, and after his apprenticeship ended, Reid lost his apprentice's lodgings. The boys had found honest work in living quarters by then, though John had gone off and gotten married and Allie soon followed, so Reid returned as certified apothecarist and soon-to-be certified pharmacist to room with his childhood gang. "No, I obviously came along to finish your alarm." He tossed the pocket watch to Felipe, who caught it. "Seeing you at your lowest is a bonus," Felipe replied with a good-natured snort before inspecting his new gadget. It flipped open with a satisfying swish. "Is the time accurate?" Reid narrowed his eyes with suspicion. "Yes." "Oh, good." The watch snapped close. "The night is still young enough to be enjoyed." Reid had never been fond of drinking and smoking as a pastime, partially due to his temperamental gift for magic. As a child, neither he nor his mother knew how to tame his outbursts, and as an adult, smoking irritated his sensitivity. Drinking was only enjoyable in moderation, which often ran away from him when he was with others. "The night is still young enough that we can return home and get a full night's sleep." "You used to be fun, Fox," Felipe chastised, but could not stop the playful grin splitting across his face. Reid's lip twitched. "And you're too broke to have any. I'll remind you, I have a new job, more to spend, and more lamp money to lose. You're up to your neck in debt, and you still want to go out?" Felipe shook his head, his smile turning coy. A true master of the craft knows while money certainly helps, it's not a requirement. He raised a single pedagogical finger before pointing it at Reid. "I mean, look at you. Your woman's the cost of postage. Though, to be honest, you could find a real one for gratis. Despite the additional fee, you're unable to enjoy any of her physicalities." Reid clicked his tongue in disapproval. Felipe lived like a rock skipping across a lake, finding joy in flight, but eventually he would be forced to find the comfort in sinking. "Someday, Felipe," he said, packing away all of his tools into his bag and ensuring they found their proper place. "You're going to fall in love and it's going to scare you." Felipe tilted his head and his expression was almost pitying. Even glued to the floor, he still managed to plow through the conversation as if it was Reid who needed a lesson. "How can you say you're in love with this girl when you haven't even seen her?" Reid rose to his feet and undid the spell work so Felipe could follow him out. A new race had started, but Reid did not look at the track. "Every day, I wake at the crack of dawn. I take a run along the river, I return to groom myself into a model apothecarist, and when I step out of the door, I'm a carefully curated presentation. People will always see the suit and the ring before they hear me. They anticipate the words I will say before I have the chance to speak. They have every right to do so, as I do as well. But if anything, seeing is deceiving." Reid had been judged when he was a boy on the street, and he would be judged if he ever became a mage at the Institute. But all three iterations, the boy, the apothecarist, and the mage, they were all the same. They were who Reid was in his letters. But there was only one person in the world who heard me before she saw me, and I've heard her as well. November 7th, 1905. Dear Miss Davis, thank you for your thoughtful reply. I read your letter once in rapt attention, once in quiet contemplation, and pondered it constantly until I was able to visit it a third time so I could write this response. I'm well acquainted with a number of women, even having met a few with some degree of magical talent, but never thought to ask why they did not pursue higher or structured magics. I'm grateful to have had the sense to ask you. Beyond comprehension, you care a great deal. Your L's swoop in such a perfect loop it could be mistaken for calligraphy, and your studying must be just as diligent. Many can claim they love something, but I caught a glimpse of your love for magic as if you broke apart before my eyes and stitched yourself up again. Our hearts beat in tandem, though they are unmistakably contained within different bodies. I'm hesitant to go into details of my own context, for I rarely divulge my desire to go to the Institute, let alone explain why. Only a few in my day-to-day life are aware of my ambitions, and the reason will become evident by the end of this letter. I was born with loud and unruly magic. My mother had no such magic, or any at all, and so I was an unmanageable child. She loved me dearly, and I loved her, but neither could lend me control. I've always had a sensitive second sense, even more so as a child, and my mother did not allow me to go to school, imagining I would become overstimulated and have an episode in the classroom. She was taken from her family when she was young, and she feared that someone would find any excuse to take me from her. Time and time again, she reminded me I would have to learn to control my magic, because if I ever lost my hold, I would be taken away to a sanatorium. You know, they do cart off children with unruly magic to the sanatoriums. Though I'm no longer a child, it is not entirely unheard of. Magical hysteria may traditionally be a diagnosis for women, but it's becoming increasingly common in men. I could be examined and discovered to contain more magic than I can control. I do not consider myself a danger to public safety, and I do not think that my magic will turn me mad, but if anyone suspected so, I could lose all that I know. It was difficult for me when my mother died. She left me with nothing but a pair of earrings, which I was so desperate not to lose I pierced my own ears with them. Without her to protect me, I thought for certain I would be found out and detained. After a few years passed, I fixed upon a new North Star. This woman was so different from the mother I'd lost. While my mother was quiet, thoughtful, and reserved, this woman was loud, impulsive, and assertive. But they both were extremely patient, especially when it came to my schooling. She introduced me to resources on structured magics, and helped me understand a formwork to which I could mold my restless energy. As I learned, I felt increasingly stable. I knew then, from the first time I read a spell to life from a book rather than from my whim, that I must learn all that I could. You see, then, it is not ambition that has led me to the Institute, as it has you, but rather self-preservation, personal protection. I know they seek talents such as mine, a sensitivity to magic and enough instinct to alter it to my will accordingly, but it's a difficult thing to translate to the page. I applied to the Institute for an undergraduate degree, and I was rejected. I shared no part of myself on the paper and had no grades to prove my capability. This is my last chance to gain access to the tools that could finally put me at ease. As I've mentioned, this is all a great secret of mine, a bit of a shame as well. I'm telling you all of this because if we ever do meet, it will be as students at the Institute, where I will be encased in the proper formwork to right myself. I will have proven to admissions that I'm capable with my gift. I regret my rambling, but I hope you do reply. I wish to support you on this endeavor any way that I can. We may be different, but different in the same way a melody and a harmony diverge. Your friend, Mr. Clark.
Chapter 7. Josephine Pinova, April 21st, 1906. Josie was not meant to be up so late, but neither was Juniper. Slinking in through the front door, Juniper froze in her rose-dusted evening gown, as if caught in an illicit act, and locked eyes with Josie, who was hunched over the kitchen table. Rather than chastise her for not making curfew, Josie's eyes returned to the work before her. Juniper's shoulders slumped in relief, only to be replaced by a scrunch of concern as her eyes roamed the papers atop the kitchen table. "Are you really still working on that same page?" Juniper asked as she approached, glancing over Josie's shoulder at her current sheet of painstakingly precise script. The corpses of the drafts that had come before it lay strewn across the kitchen table or crumpled and heaped in a waste bin settled at her feet. Josie kept her eyes fixed to her quarter-filled page, already slashed with numerous errors. "Well, to be fair, it's only meant to be one page." "It's been 3 hours." Juniper picked up a wayward draft off the table. "Is this an ad? Half of it will be pictures anyway." Josie hadn't even begun to consider possible graphics for the advertisement she intended to send out for the apothecary. The consideration infused her with even more dread. "The shorter it is, the less tolerance I have for error." Juniper balled up the sheet of paper in her fist. "Put yourself out of your misery and just write to Peter. I'm sure he has some material you can borrow." Tresport and Summerford are like night and day. In Summerford, her mother ran the healing practice, and her brother ran the apothecary. It was a closed, symbiotic loop, and there was no other competition for many miles. The people of the surrounding cities visited her mother if they needed something healed, and she referred them to Peter to fulfill their treatments. The community had relied on her family for their magical remedies for generations. "Peter knows a lot about potions, less about marketing." Juniper raised a shapely eyebrow. "And you know anything about marketing?" "As soon as I walked into the doors of that apothecary, I might as well have written the manual on marketing." It was a polite way of saying that no one there had ever considered what it meant to be a business. They were all technically trained apothecarists, not promoters. She had no real business experience, but marketing was a performance like any other, and frighteningly similar to how she'd fought to prove her capabilities her entire life. "Somehow I've been designated as the person to pull this off." Her sister plucked another draft off the table and attempted to decipher what Josie had written, but to no avail. "Pull what off exactly?" "Well," Josie perked up in her seat with the first burst of confidence she'd been able to summon that night. No one ever asked her what she had planned, only expected she produce results. Mr. Goranov always thanked her emphatically when she had something to show. Mr. Reid simply did not care either way. "I don't think it'd be very effective if we sent a mailer to everyone in the city and hoped that they'll be enticed. Perhaps they might remember we exist when in need, but I doubt it. We must deliver these to those who seek us." Her sister snorted. "So what? You're going to pass them out to everyone entering the university's apothecary with the hope that they'll change their mind if they see a better deal?" Josie leveled her sister an incredulous look. It was too late in the night for humor. "No," she countered. "Since healers have become less popular, I'm sending the mailer out to hospitals or the offices of doctor mages so they'll be more inclined to refer their patients to the Tresport apothecary." The doctor mage who had treated Josie after the explosion had inspired the idea, but Josie had never shared the specifics of that day with her sister. As far as Juniper was concerned, Josie's bandaged hand had been the result of clumsiness. There was no reason to worry needlessly. Most of the time, Juniper's glimpses into the future caught any true catastrophes. They both would be forewarned if anything truly terrible were to happen. Probably. Wait. Josie reconsidered any subtle implications of Juniper's inquiry. She could never be too sure if she was joking. Juniper sometimes folded her predictions up in a humorous jab. "Unless you're trying to tell me that it would be worth it to poach the university's patrons at the source, would it be?" To Josie's disappointment, Juniper plopped down into the chair opposite her and collapsed onto the table, head buried in her arms and reply muffled. "I don't know, Jojo." Josie winced. Perhaps she should have been more concerned when Juniper arrived home late, but she hated to put undue pressure on her sister. They both faced enough suffocation. She quested cautiously. "How was your day today?" "The same as always." Juniper attempted a shrug before lifting her head. She leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling rather than at Josie. "But it's becoming quite exhausting to be so beautiful and charming all the time," she said with the arid dejection of both a dry joke and a cry for help. Josie could not know for sure if her complaint was professional or personal, but she suspected it was both. In Juniper's line of work, the lines often blurred, as her clients' fates were her business. "I'm sure it is." Josie eased her reply by cracking a light-hearted smile as she reached across the table for her sister's lace-gloved hand. She had not expected it to be so cold. "But it's only so difficult now because you must work so hard to establish yourself. Once you have your reputation settled, everything will be much easier." Or, Juniper closed her eyes, "perhaps I am setting myself up for failure by letting everyone become accustomed to an amount of effort that's simply unsustainable. So don't let that happen." She squeezed her hand and suppressed the edge of jealousy in her voice as she said, "Pace yourself. Your ledgers have been good the last few weeks. You can afford it." "And do what?" "I don't know. Summer is approaching and the expo begins soon." Josie suppressed a wince as she recalled the expo, regretting the suggestion the moment it left her lips. It was an enormous exposition held every summer in Tressport, with a spotlight on technological advancements, a far cry from the quaint seasonal festivals in Summerford. The youngest of her three siblings, Nadine, desperately wished to go and requested Josie visit to pen a vicariously vivid letter. But last summer had come and gone, and Josie had not been able to find the time to see the expo. "There are many things to do in the city." Juniper's frown deepened. "Alone?" Josie could have laughed. Every night she was out with someone new. "Haven't you been making friends here?" "None that I can be ugly with." Juniper grumbled pitifully, another pang of regret. "Then I'll go with you." "And how long would I have to wait for a slot in your schedule to open up?" "Just after university acceptances come out," Josie replied, complete earnestness absorbing the impact of her sister's barb. "I'm trying my best to keep the shop afloat, but I can't do it forever, especially if no one else is actually doing anything. This is not a task fit for one person, and I'm loath to be held solely responsible if things go awry. No. Things will change, especially if I plan to work while attending university. I must be able to make time for other people, like you." Juniper leaned in conspiratorially. "And Mr. Letters?" Josie couldn't remember if she had told her sister of her plans or if she'd inferred them, but it didn't much matter. "Yes, we are making plans to meet next month after acceptances are sent out. And though I'm extremely fond of him, I can't imagine he'll consume so much of my time that I lose sight of everything else." Truthfully, she did not know what she would do once she was in her dream academic program. It had been the whole of her focus for her entire life. She had played the pianoforte when she was younger, but let it fall to the wayside to pursue her studies. Once she had been invited to join a women's club in Summerford, but after weeks of promising she would go to the next meeting, she was forced to admit that she would never be able to find the time. Juniper narrowed her brown eyes. "If you really loved him, you wouldn't be so sure." "I do love him." Josie's stare was hard, persuasive. I think you do, too," her sister admitted, surprising her with a shrug. "You do?" Josie tried not to seem too eager for a possible reading from her sister, though she could not help but fidget with the pen in her hand. "Why?" "Because," Juniper rummaged through the pile of papers Josie had let accumulate on the kitchen table under the delusion that she'd tend to them later. She fished out an envelope. Josie could recognize her mother's whirlwind scrawl. There would be 2 letters tucked within, one from her mother and one from Nadine, with their respective bi-weekly updates, sharing an envelope to save on postage. Juniper slid the envelope across the table, and Josie swallowed a lump forming at the back of her throat. She'd not sent a letter to her mother or Nadine since her termination, nearly a month and a half now. "No matter how many envelopes arrive, Mr. Letters is the only person you've made a habit of replying to. It was difficult for Josie to gauge if the mailers had been successful. The trickle of customers was steady, and they were certainly walking away with more products than they would have been otherwise. After she began to ask customers how they had heard of the shop while checking out, she discovered the mailer had increased visits by approximately 20%. If the shop finally reached its profit goals, she planned to present her calculation at the end of the month. Josie was marking down the tally of the woman who had been referred by a friend when she spotted someone descending from Mr. Goronov's apartments. She had not noticed him when he came in, perhaps because she had been preoccupied with her customer, but if he was a guest of Mr. Goronov, she wouldn't hound him. Fully intending to let him escape unbothered, she cast her eyes on the tally with a vigorous interest. A deep voice called down to her.
Excuse me, are you Miss Pinova?
Her gaze snapped upward to greet his, startled heart beating hard. Yes, I am. Can I help you? He was a tall man, though not as tall as Mr. Reid, in a modest tan suit contrasting brightly against his brown skin. His features were well assembled, his countenance well maintained, without a hair out of place or a speck of dirt beneath his fingernails. Yet a scar sliced into the far end of his left eyebrow. There were calluses on his hands and deep creases in his tan derbies. She did not know what to make of the contradiction.
Oh.
He smiled, and it was friendly, much kinder than most cast toward a female clerk at an apothecary. She knew very well how men smiled when they were interested in her, and this certainly was not that either.
I'm only an acquaintance of Reid.
I'm afraid Mr. Reid is out at the moment. Would you like me to take a message for him? From time to time, Mr. Goronov, or now this man, referred to Mr. Reid as simply Reid, as if it was his first name. It made her feel silly when she replied with his title.
That won't be necessary.
He waved the request aside with a good-natured grin.
I was just wondering, can you recommend me a long-lasting pain balm? Preferably something I haven't heard of before.
Her mother always complained that patients were never specific enough, and Josie replied the same way her mother would have. Muscle pain.
It's in the knee.
The answer came to her easily. She could not sense this man's pain, lacking her mother's finesse of second sense, precise enough to detect and diagnose anomalies, but she had memorized her entire array of treatments. Stripe seed is the best general treatment for joint pain, but the knee is burdened by so much stress, it'd be wiser to purchase something more aggressive, like a Montalbalm. We do not carry it readily available, but if you submit an order, we'll be happy to produce it for you.
If that's the case, I'd like to submit an order for pickup. Would Sunday be possible?
He nodded politely before his lips tilted in a proud smile.
You know, I assumed you'd have something new up your sleeve. Reid did mention that you were very knowledgeable.
She could not stop herself from scoffing, though she sensed that the man was not the type to mind. Oh, he did he? If Mr. Reid had, it was certainly a euphemism for a more choice insult. If she had to hazard a guess, it'd be that he'd called her a Weisenheimer.
Indeed he did. He may never admit it, but he can recognize when someone is playing to their strengths.
His voice possessed a deep, velveteen smoothness.
He is also stubborn enough to give them a hard time about it.
Josie wished she could have felt uneasy with just how much the stranger knew about what lay between her and her ornery co-worker, but she found comfort in his reassurance. She smiled as she asked, "Sorry, you didn't mention it. How do you know Mr. Reid?"
We've been friends for a very long time.
It was difficult for her to imagine Mr. Reid as having any friends, especially any who were particularly kind, but she could not deny the evidence presented before her. The man's eyes slid to the hands of the grandfather clock behind her.
I wish I could tell the entire story, as you do seem like a lovely conversationalist. But I must be going now.
"Wait!" She called as he turned to leave, and he responded with a surprised glance over his shoulder. "What's your name?" "For the order."
Oh.
An unusually long beat of silence passed as he wrestled with a reply.
Put me down as Sam.
Josie should have insisted on a last name, as it was proper procedure, but Sam was gone before she had the chance to ask. Mr. Goranov would not process the order without a surname, but Josie was intent on ensuring Sam received his balm, so she filled it out as Sam Zachariah. He certainly did not look like a Zachariah, but Josie would remember him for pickup, though she would not be able to fulfill his order. Without an apothecarist's ring, Josie was not qualified to fill custom orders or prescriptions, but she could mix together basic balms and elixirs. They were by far the most common items purchased at the apothecary, as individual ingredients used for spell work were impossible to sell to the layperson. Just as she tucked away her tallies, she heard the tinkle of the bell over the door and perked up to greet another customer. But it was only Mr. Reid. Josie took a breath, about to tell him that his friend had dropped by, but he cast his eyes downward and powered past her, disappearing into the back room without even a word of greeting. She shut her mouth, careful to control her rising annoyance, as Mr. Reid would have certainly been able to sense it. Josie prayed for a customer soon, anything to prevent her stewing there with nothing but her thoughts. Removing her gilded compact, she used its mirror to touch up her lipstick. She only owned one bullet of true rouge, but a simple glamour adjusted its application to different shades to better suit her dress. Today, a warm terracotta matched the stripes on her tan blouse. She was blotting her lips with a handkerchief for the final time when her wish was granted. The man who entered was noticeably different from the apothecary's typical clientele, and Josie was grateful she'd touched up her makeup. His magic was dense and flush against him, reeled in so incredibly tight she doubted he could sense anything around him. He was clean-cut and clean-shaven, with a face hailing from old money and a suit to match. He held his hat respectfully, displaying slick auburn hair and an intact hairline, no older than 30. The man was so familiar, Josie had to keep herself from staring. "Can I help you today, sir?" Her grin was potent with overcompensation for both her mood and her curiosity.
Yes.
He cleared his throat. He kept glancing at the ring for assistance bell, but did not make a move for it.
I am looking for thrinal root.
Thrinal root was not kept on display in the front due to its sensitive nature. Though not dangerous, it was notorious for ruining potions, as it was often confused with phenol, a common ingredient. One would only request it with certainty, and it was only certainly required for complex spells. The nature of the request prompted her to inspect this man again, and her eye snagged on his breast. Against the rich mahogany color of his suit, a mage's pin gleamed golden. Perhaps Josie should have stared, or at the very least recognized his status upon first inspection. "I'll collect it from the back right away," she said, surprised she did not stutter. She ignored Mr. Reid upon her return, but he did not ignore her. As she reached for the thrinal root, he asked,
"Charlie's here."
"Who?" she replied, but he was already clambering to his feet and tugging at the hem of his suit jacket. He followed on her heels, ducking beneath the door to avoid hitting his head against its short frame.
"Reid,"
the man asked as he caught sight of him. Josie placed the jar of thrinal root on the counter, though she might as well have been the countertop fern for the amount of attention she was paid.
"Good morning."
Mr. Reid greeted the man with an uncharacteristic vigor. He sounded to Josie as if he was smiling, but she thought she must be mistaken. Sure enough, though, his lips had upturned.
"You haven't been around in a while."
The maid shrugged good-naturedly.
"Things have been busy at the Institute."
Josie perked up, refusing to be cast to the wayside. "You work at the Institute?" Mr. Reid snorted, and she frowned at him, cross. She attempted to think of an off-the-cuff comment that would transfer the blame of her obliviousness onto him, but before she could, the mage continued.
"Allow me to introduce myself. I am Professor Charles Cavendish Porter, soon to be head of the Metallocemy Department at the University of Tresport's Institute of Magic."
She extended her hand for him to shake. "My name is Josephine Pinova." And then, as if possessed by some bold spirit, she addendumed, "My friends call me Josie." Rather than shaking her hand, he brought it to his lips and planted a feather-like kiss across her knuckles.
"Enchanted to meet you, Ms. Josie Pinova."
Josie blushed like a schoolgirl. She knew the name Charles Cavendish Porter from scanning the newspaper over morning tea and toast. He and his company's practices always seemed to be in the headlines in some way or another, but she only skimmed the business columns. The Cavendish Porters had made a fortune in producing copper goods and were among the oldest families in Tresport. They were not a family with a history of magical inclination, but with all that wealth to fall back on, a man like Charles Cavendish Porter could pursue any career or whim he so desired. Charles, the only child of the current self-styled King of Copper, had chosen the calling of an academic. When he was no older than Josie herself, he had discovered an advancement in metal alchemy, allowing for the automated mass production of traditionally hand-warded copper products, such as nick-proof pots or non-corrosive pipes. Josie had never encountered a celebrity or a genius, and she was not sure how to avoid becoming overwhelmed, because Charles Cavendish Porter was both.
Did you say you were set to become head of metal alchemy? So they're finally offering you tenure then?
Mr. Reid asked from beside her. Josie's heart made a small, inopportune trill. She associated Mr. Clark so closely with his area of study, it was as if the mention of metal alchemy was a mention of him.
I've been meaning to come by and tell you the news. It won't be for another decade or so, but the path has been duly laid.
Professor Cavendish Porter replied with a wink.
Well, congratulations.
Mr. Reid was actually and truly beaming. Josie could not believe it.
I was beginning to worry that they'd never recognize all that you've accomplished. As was I.
The professor replied with a huff, but then embraced again his genial smile.
I didn't want to keep you in the dark, but I hadn't found the time to slip away until old Dr. Pewter mentioned he had a visit with Mr. Goranov.
Mr. Reid nodded and turned to Josie to elaborate. It was the first time he'd addressed her directly in 4 days.
Professor Pewter is the head of apothecary science at the university and a longtime friend of Mr. Goranov. We are the exclusive suppliers for a number of specialty items that the university does not carry, so we see faculty and students every so often. I like to keep stocked up on my Thrinal root.
Professor Cavendish Porter tapped fondly on the lid of the jar. It was one of the more expensive items in the shop, but Josie was already considering how she might convince one of the richest men in the city to increase his order.
For a moment, when I saw Ms. Pinova at the counter, I thought that you had finally quit, Reid.
So even he refused to refer to Mr. Reid by his first name. Perhaps Mr. Reid thought a first name extraneous to his way of life, alongside pleasantries or a personality.
No, I'm afraid I'm tied to this place for the time being.
He raised his right hand to display his apothecarist's ring.
Ms. Pinova is a new employee, not my replacement in any way.
Professor Cavendish Porter's eye drifted to her naked hand.
Oh, is she keeping the place orderly, like Miss Clara did?
Mr. Reid's magic flickered. Josie did not know who Mrs. Clara was, but she assumed she was some sort of assistant and frowned. No, she clarified. I am knowledgeable in the trade, so I work as a clerk. I also hope to develop a few remedies of my own. He shrugged, as if it were an apology, and pulled out his wallet to signal the end of his visit.
I have several female students at the Institute. It's becoming more and more common to see women interested in the structured magics.
That it is, she said, relieved she would not have to become defensive. She liked the professor well enough. If she could make a friend of him, as Mr. Reid had, then perhaps her chances at admission to the Institute would increase. Josie was just about to ring up his total when she decided to test her luck. Her second sense may have been weak, but she knew a smoker when she met one. Have you ever tried windworm, Professor? She leaned over the counter, but not so far as to be shameless, and made an attempt at persuasion by batting her wide, doe-like eyes. She leaned into her rural accent, accentuating its charming twang. Where I'm from, people like to sprinkle some into their pipe or dip their cigarettes into the stuff. It can enhance your energy for a longer period after a smoke. The unprocessed plant is local, but it's most effective ground into a powder. His eyes glinted with a hint of mirth, but he reached for an additional bill before he said,
I do think that could be helpful, I'll take 2 vials.
Mr. Reid's magic soured, with such potency that she almost gagged. But she ignored the sensation by focusing on how the professor's hand lingered against hers as he handed her his payment. November 15th, 1905. Dear Mr. Clark, it seems we have inverse afflictions and twin salvations. My sensitivity to magic is not acute enough, whereas yours is too strong. Perhaps if we ever cross paths, we'll rub off on one another just enough to maintain a proper equilibrium. I do not know which breaks my heart more, that you saw your magic as a hindrance or that you did not have anyone to share it with. All too often, when telling such a story, we can expect to be met with condolences, even pity. You say you are a private person, and that not many know what you've endured. So, if you have never heard the sentiment, I am sorry. If anything, I am glad that, amidst the loss, you found someone who elucidated what a gift you possess. I imagine it was exceedingly comforting to have someone look at you and recognize what you are able to do. So often, I feel as if people doubt my potential. I cannot only be proficient, I must be loud in it. While at times this can become humiliating, there is some silver lining. While I had no one who could show me where my possibilities lay, I can do that for others. My youngest sister also yearns to follow the path I've laid. When I remember it, it encourages me to push forward. She's a much quicker study than I ever was, and for every first I accomplish, I can be comforted by the fact that it will be easier for her to be the second. In a way, I wish to give her a comfort I never possessed. If it's worth anything, I am also glad that we have found one another, so that I can admire it in you as well. Even if I never receive another letter from you, you helped enchant my glasses, and I will always be grateful. Sincerely, Ms. Davis.
Chapter 8. Aufidius Reid. April 30th, 1906. Some instinct gripped Reid, and before he realized he'd done it, the shop's door locked with a nudge from his magic. The man pacing the length of the apothecary's frontage was familiar in a way that often signaled trouble for Reid. His silver head bowed as he pulled a watch from the pocket of his brown tweed suit and checked the time. Then, tucking his hands beneath his arms against the windchill, he glanced into the apothecary window as if waiting for someone. Reid stared at the man with unwavering intensity as he attempted to excavate the source of his unease from some hazy corner of his memory. Reid could almost trace the silhouette of his magic veiled behind a second sense ward, as if trying to recall someone from the sound of footfalls he hadn't heard since childhood. It was possible he'd encountered the man when he was a child on the streets. It was also possible the man was a member of the Protect Our Workers organization, one of the protesters, or more aptly, hecklers. There hadn't been an attack in the last few weeks, and they were just about due. What did you do that for? Miss Pinova tilted her head in the direction of the door. She just returned from picking some bowu sprouts to replenish the stock in the front and dropped the bushel on the counter. Who's that? With an uncomfortable jolt, Reid remembered there was now someone in the shop who could sense his magic. He was in the habit of concealing his moods most of the time, but there was no means of hiding castings. He forced himself to remember that such displays of magic were normal to her, if she was a pagan or a witch or whatever else kept her from wearing a second sense ward. Reid struggled to find an answer from Miss Pinova. The last time he'd introduced her to someone, she'd nearly poached his friend. She'd gained Charlie's favor almost instantaneously, much faster than Reid had. Everyone who entered the shop found themselves smitten by her, and by virtue of Reid's introduction, Charlie had been no exception. Though, in this instance, he could not make any proper introduction between Miss Pinova and the man outside anyway. Reid ground his teeth as he mulled over the man's identity. a cold metallic tang of recollection at the back of his throat. The sound of Mr. Gornoff's steps signaled the descent from his office. He had caught the tail end of Miss Pinova's question and asked, while adjusting his emerald tie to presentability, "And what did Reid do?" "He locked the door," she replied. She cocked her head at Reid as if for an answer, but he did not have one to offer her. If anything, he wanted to ask Mr. Gornoff who the man was and if his caution was warranted, but his employer seemed largely unconcerned. "Unlock the door, Reid," he said with a sigh. The command startled Reid from his trance. He blinked the surprise from his eyes as he cast a questioning glance at Mr. Gornoff. Just as easily as it had been locked, the door unlocked. "That man is an associate," Mr. Gornoff explained. "Our meeting concerns a business transaction." Both Miss Pinova and Reid stared, hoping the silence might coax a proper explanation from their boss, but he offered none. Reid remained unconvinced. The likelihood that the silver-haired man was an investor or another bidder to buy the apothecary dwindled when Mr. Gornoff did not invite him into his office. Instead, he bid his employees farewell with a small wave of his hand and went to greet the man outside with a stiff nod. Together, Reid and Miss Pinova watched as the two traced a path along the outline of Lake Ketchineppie. Reid itched with the incessant feeling that he should not have let Mr. Gornoff go out alone. Miss Pinova, on the other hand, seemed not to care in the slightest as she resumed tending to her bundle of bowu. Desperate for an activity into which he could retreat, Reid vanished into the cool comfort of the back room and began to do the weekly tallies. Some childlike naivete in him had thought the apothecary invincible, but this visit was a reckoning of the severity of their situation. Reid not only tallied the inventory, but also double-checked it for good measure. An eternity passed before Mr. Gornoff returned to the apothecary and joined him in the back room. As if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, Mr. Gornoff headed for the distilling station and began measuring a draught of perlochinate, hunched over the table in the low light as the viscous violet liquid dripped from the spout like molasses. A perfect picture from Reid's childhood, but only for a frame, as Mr. Gornoff's hand, once steady, now shook. As a child, Reid would have been instructed to watch carefully and say nothing, but his time as a pupil had passed, so Reid cleared his throat before approaching. He knew Mr. Gornoff would remain tight-lipped about his meeting with the silver-haired man, but he hoped a return to their roles of student and teacher could dislodge his reluctance. "Do you need any help, sir?" The old man remained fixed on his task, replying to Reid as if he were an afterthought. "No, thank you." Reid was not sure what to say. The man very rarely accepted support, so much so he didn't even let Reid prepare his personal medications or take any meetings on his behalf. So Reid offered it the only way he could. "Would you like me to distill any more perlochinate? We're running low." "We're fine." They were not fine. Only bad news demanded obfuscation and secrecy. But perhaps Reid could redirect the tide of their fortune. "You've probably already considered it, but it could be a good idea if the shop established some sort of regular exchange with the university to meet our profit quota. I know you've met with Dr. Pewter recently, and..." Mr. Gornoff did not offer him even a considering glance. "Simply work the storefront, Reid. We have no customers." He had made a small number of the superfluous wellness sales that Mr. Gornoff pushed for at Miss Pinova's insistence, but Reid was sure those customers would not become regulars. They were in desperate need of a reliable clientele. Mr. Gornoff grew cross, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. "You should not make such an assertion before checking first." "I do not need to go out to the front to check," Reid said with patience, though the reminder still inspired a fair degree of self-consciousness. His second sense could detect if 2 plants had been switched in the shop, let alone if an entire person entered. Miss Pinova now covered the front, buzzing like a hummingbird as she flittered from end to replenish the shelves. If he closed his eyes, he could almost see how her plum-colored skirt twisted about her hips as she moved. Mr. Gornoff had never been fond of the depth of Reid's magical talent, even without an inkling of how far it extended. Gornoff often wore a second sense ward, only retaining enough magical competency to adequately complete the functions of his job when required. His wife had possessed all the magical intuition in the couple, an interest she shared with Reid rather than her tangibly oriented husband. But while Mr. Gornoff had found his wife's second sensitivity endearing, he found it uncanny in Reid. Mr. Gornoff's thin lips tightened into a line, his sympathy from earlier in the day nowhere to be found. Then assist Miss Pinova with however she is busying herself. Frustration curdled deep within Reid, but he did not let it manifest in his disposition. He nodded, though he had no intention of following the command. He left the back room and continued through the front until he exited the shop. Caught between Mr. Gornoff's disappointment and Miss Pinova's disapproval, he could no longer tolerate any of it. The cool breeze of a spring morning glided across the waterfront, preferable to the swelter at the heart of the city, and it was early enough in the day to ambulate comfortably in a full suit without sweating half to death. Reid traced the path to the university along the lakefront. Even if Mr. Gornoff would not listen to him, something must be done about the apothecary's poor circumstances, and perhaps Charlie could help, especially if they could speak without Miss Pinova distracting him. The fetid smell of fresh asphalt wafted from the new construction adjacent to the apothecary, another extension of the meat-packing plant. The industrial street was desolate, everyone consumed by their factory shift. Reid passed a sausage-making facility, which was once Doc's Market, the store where he had met Aunt Clara when he was 13. Reid hadn't made a conscious decision to steal the apple, the action not premeditated or intentional, but a reflex, a habit. But unlike the other hundreds of times he'd skimmed food from a market display without anyone the wiser, this time he'd been caught. He had fallen out of the habit of cloaking his magic, as doing so was a great bother and most wore second sense wards. No one expected a child to be capable of a glamour spell, but as his luck yielded, there was a very specific witness to his petty crime. Clara Gornoff could see through glamour. She'd been born with the gift, leading her to a delicate interest in glamour casting and potions making and, eventually, to the apothecary apprentice who became her future husband, Ivan Gornoff. She did not have the chance to make use of her gift frequently, but she managed to see the sparkle of magic surrounding a young boy casually palming an apple and stuffing it into his pocket. She had grabbed his arm, and he was convinced that she would either cut off his hand or send him to the sanatorium. If it was the former option, he hoped it would be the weaker of his 2 hands. If it was the latter, he hoped the train there would derail in a fiery inferno like he'd seen in the moving pictures. Instead, she had asked him, "Why were you stealing?" Despite his terror, the answer was obvious. "To eat." "What about your parents? Haven't got any family at all?" He'd called Felipe his brother plenty of times, but he wouldn't dare implicate the rest of the boys in his folly. "No, ma'am." She gave him a pitiful frown, the same sort a nun offered with a loaf of bread or a sorry, well-dressed lady directed his way before handing him a nickel. He thought she'd buy him another apple. Instead, she invited him to dinner. Mr. Gornoff met Reid with a scowl and a complaint, but his wife insisted. Reid was on his best behavior during the meal, polite as he answered questions. He spoke wonderfully. How was he educated? His mother taught him. Had she taught him the glamour spell as well? No, he taught himself all of his magic. Really? Yes, ma'am. He did not tell her that the stall awning that had collapsed when she gripped his wrist had been one of his accidental outbursts. By the end of dinner, Mrs. Clara didn't have the heart to turn him back onto the street. The Goronoffs had an empty apprentice's chambers, though Reid was much too young to become an apprentice by Mr. Goronoff's standards. Mrs. Clara insisted Reid would be a quick and obedient study, and because Mr. Goronoff loved his wife, he obliged. Everything was now unrecognizable from the way it had been all those years ago. Doc's Market was gone, and so was Aunt Clara, and so was the comforting cloak of the bustle of the street. He had become a stranger in his own home. As he reached the end of the desolate stretch of road that had once housed various magical emporiums and practices, he still sensed the outer edges of the vortex, but also the distant call of another magic center in the city. Warehouses gave way to storefronts, cracked pavement to tree-lined avenues, cheap convenience stores to proper dine-in restaurants, until he found himself at the gates of the University of Tresport. The apothecary sat on a natural vortex, but the university was an artificial pinch point of magic by virtue of containing so many enchantments, artifacts, and casters in one place. Reid was no stranger to the university, though with each visit he was struck at how insular the campus was, as if it were its own microcosm divorced from the world, and not a pocket in one of the largest cities in the country. Leafy canopies lining the walkways enhanced the red of the grand bricked lecture halls and auditoriums. The landscape frontage of the apothecary had been torn out and paved years ago, so the living buzz of vegetation scattered throughout the university was a nostalgic comfort. Birds chirped across branches, squirrels scurried along the broad oak trunks, and students conversed on benches in the tree's shade. Most of the students were young men, clean-shaven and bright-eyed, as enthusiastic as he had been when he first applied. Their suits were pristinely sewn and custom-tailored, much nicer than he could afford. The worries these men would face slowly escalated from passing a class to being promoted at work until they finally plateaued after starting a family. If he were accepted at the institute, Reid could see his life following the same predictable trajectory. He'd always been one lost job or stranger's police report away from having his life overturned, dangling off the cliff of ruin. But as he imagined himself among these fresh-faced students, he felt solid earth beneath his feet. On his way to the faculty offices, Reid found Charles Cavendish Porter loitering at the edge of a stone-lipped pool, memorializing the founding of the university. "Reid?" Charlie called, recognizing Reid before he had the chance to greet him. He waved in return as he approached. "Heyo, Charlie." It was almost unsettling to call Charlie by his first name in a place where he was primarily referred to as Professor or Dr. Cavendish Porter. Similarly, it was strange to think of them as friends, as something so informal, but Reid had been charitably granted the right. Charlie was only 4 years his senior, nowhere near old enough to necessitate formalities, and they had been friends for years. Despite how familiar they had grown, Reid could never shake the nervous fluster of celebrity he felt, positioned adjacent to someone as young, charming, and accomplished as Charlie. "What are you doing here?" Charlie asked, more pleased than surprised, and clasped Reid's arm. Greeted with the familiar onslaught of enthusiasm, Reid warmed into a smile. Perhaps asking for assistance would not be so hard, but he knew he could not say it outright at first. "I thought I'd take a walk during my work break. It has been..." He didn't know how to finish his sentence. "Slow." "That bad? And here I was thinking that you missed me." Charlie offered a sly smile, a possible allusion to the few times he had invited him out. Reid had come to the conclusion that Charlie only asked out of courtesy, but perhaps his offers had been genuine. Still, Reid did as he often did and politely ignored the comment. Nothing unmanageable, he clarified with caution. He couldn't bring himself to vent frustrations with someone who did not also hold a fondness for the apothecary. But change can always be challenging. I read the apothecary profile in the paper. Charlie nodded. Very adorable. But I was surprised to see that mention of the POWO's vandalism was practically a footnote. I didn't have that impression the last time we spoke. Have they gotten any worse? Reid could not recall what he told Charlie about the POWO's attacks on the store. Reid must have asked if they also targeted the university's apothecary, but he took care to refrain from elaborating on the Tressport apothecary's own struggles. The POWO intended to paint the shop in an unsafe light, and Reid wanted no hand in perpetuating that impression. If possible, they're the only thing that's remained constant. Charlie raised an eyebrow. What then? You can't be referring to that pretty foreign girl you work with, can you? What a shame. I liked her. He pulled out a gold tin of cigarettes and motioned them toward Reid as if to offer them. Reid saw a brief flash of red, either anger or jealousy. He attempted to dispel both, the mention of Miss Pinova and the cigarettes, with a wave of his hand, praying he did not seem too flustered. Well, I don't know if it would be accurate to call Miss Pinova a challenge, but she is an adjustment. She's quite adept at her job, he admitted. She was a much better salesperson than he and could navigate questions about inventory as well as any apothecarist. Her elixir had been a clue into some further talent, but if he wished to unearth its depths, he would have to actually talk to her, which he most certainly did not want to do. Pinova, Charlie replied, as if he'd heard the name before. Yes, Josephine Pinova. He took a slow drag of a cigarette thoughtfully. She's a witch, no? Is her magic any good? She may be pagan. I'm not too sure, though she is unlike any witch I've ever met. Not all witches were pagans, but all pagans were witches. To be a witch was to be a woman who dutifully practiced her magic intuitively. To be a pagan was to adhere to a spiritual belief system that stressed the importance of understanding one's own magic. Reid didn't care what she was either way, but it bothered him that she had refused to tell him. Her casual reliance on magic was distinctly indicative of a witchling upbringing. There were Baptian witches, pagan families who had converted and kept many traditions, but Miss Pinova refused to identify herself as such. In fact, her magic did not strike him as that of a witch's at all. It was too intentional, controlled. He was very familiar with wild magic, and he saw none of himself in her. How curious. Charlie's face unfurled in interest. I've never seen a woman truly wish to work in the structured magics like her, pagan or not. But if she is a bother, you'll be free of her soon enough once you're accepted. If I'm accepted, Reid corrected. He was still not sure if he could leave the apothecary for a degree. He would certainly need to reduce his hours to accommodate schoolwork, but he had little means of affording tuition. With a start, he realized that in approximately 3 months, there was a good chance he would not have the apothecary's paycheck to lean back on, whether he wanted it or not. He should ask Charlie for help with the apothecary. It was why he had come, after all. He was sure to have contacts at the university who could make a substantial order for a specialty project, or perhaps even know someone in the industrial sector who could become a repeat client. It would be wise to ask, but Mr. Goranov had just struck the casual mention of the idea down with such brute force that Reid thought it best to formulate a proper proposal, so thorough that his boss would have no choice but to accept. Then he could ask Charlie when he had a proper excuse to seek him out, preferably after admission decisions were released. Charlie smiled at him, unaware of his predicament, and offered a humble shrug. It's best to stay positive about these things. Did you know they're sending out acceptances roughly 3 weeks from now, the middle of May? Really? Reid caught his heartbeat quickening. The two of them had discussed his application before, but nerves accompanied each instance. Acceptance felt so achingly near when he was with Charlie. He controlled his expression so as to not seem too eager. What else do you know? Oh, I'm not on the admissions committee. Charlie released an unconcerned puff of his cigarette, otherwise unreadable. Mages did not wear second sense wards, but even without it, he suppressed his magical signature to an incredibly restrained degree. It had always been difficult to differentiate his moods or casting from his faint, nonchalant hum, but when he looked at Reid again, a sly smile tugged at his lips. But I suppose you'll find out soon enough. I suppose I will, Reid repeated, reining in his wildest hopes. His eyes unfocused as he imagined walking these paths as a student, the silhouette of Miss Davis by his side. Charlie raised his voice to shake Reid from his daze. What do you think you'll do after you earn your pin? Still intent on industry? It would only take 2 years to walk out of the university with his master's degree and pin. He hadn't given it much thought, but he was sure he'd be done with academia. Yes, industry. But not magical industry, if I can help it. Hybrid, if the protests haven't snuffed it out by then. Magotechnology. Then you've applied for a metal alchemy degree? Charlie nodded, as if to agree with his own assumption, and watched the smoke waft between them. If that's the case, perhaps after you've earned your pin, if you're fond of copper, I could find you a job. Reid hadn't let himself hope for Charlie to extend him the opportunity. Really? He nodded. I'm quite serious. You've helped me out of a pickle plenty of times, and I know you'd bring the same performance at Cavendish Copper. How involved are you with the company? He couldn't imagine that Charlie had enough spare time to dedicate to both academia and industry, but he hoped he would see a good deal of him even after graduating. Reid must have worn his wishes on his face. A fair amount. He winked, amused. Cavendish Copper funds my research, so I must make time for both. I wish I could elaborate on the work, but I only came out here for a quick smoke. I'm not allowed cigs in the lab because it can interfere with the setting enchantments. My office is a few buildings down that way. Too far from the labs if you ask me. It's all very bothersome, and I have a meeting in a few minutes. But in a month, I'll be the first to buy you a drink the moment admissions release. We'll celebrate and talk all of this over. How does that sound? A resounding yes leapt to the tip of Reid's tongue, but it was halted at the last moment. That sounds wonderful, but I promised someone else that I'd celebrate or commiserate with them first. He attempted to apologize, but no regret leached into his voice. Though he did yearn for the chance to finally go out with Charlie, he would have numerous more opportunities to do so. He would only ever have one first meeting with Miss Davis. November 17th, 1905. Dear Miss Davis, thank you for your reply. I found it quite insightful. Your sister is very lucky to have a mentor such as yourself. I cannot relate in the strictest sense. I've never had to set an example, for I'm afraid no one is watching me in that respect. I don't have a family, and of what friends I do have, none of them are interested in pursuing magic. In actuality, the one friend I have who is interested in the field of structured magics has already achieved much success in that field. I met him while he was a student. He's not so much older than me, But he was in university and I was not, and so he seemed much more grown than I'd ever be. He asked for my opinion and considered it seriously, which I treasured tremendously. After our chance encounter, it was difficult to scrub such an infatuating experience from my mind. The university lab, the men who occupied it, the purpose they fulfilled. I wanted nothing more than to take a bench and sit across from them, important and appreciated. I would have done anything for him to notice me again, and one day he did. I consider myself extremely privileged to have made his acquaintance, as he has adjusted the trajectory of my life. We're not close, but he did inspire me to pursue university and, more specifically, to choose metal alchemy as my field of study. His support has made a world of difference in gaining the confidence to submit my application. I suppose, even from this angle, as the mentee rather than the mentor, it is a tremendous amount of pressure. There is a constant strain I feel to impress him, perhaps to please him. If I lose his favor, what does that mean for my capabilities or my prospects? You do not have to answer. I know I'm being irrational. I am interested in hearing more of your plans after enrollment. You must have thought of how your life would change on campus. Please, I eagerly await your next letter. Your friend, Mr. Clark.
Chapter 9. Josephine Pinova, May 7th, 1906. Josie loved the apothecary's greenhouse. She had moved to Tresport to be closer to her aspirations, not farther from her family in Summerford, and the greenhouse felt like home. The clean green scent transported her to afternoons with her brother. He would tediously harvest the leaves one by one off of a bushy foxfoot as she asked him to explain all its uses. Once Josie was granted a key to the Tresport apothecary, she took advantage of her all-hours access. Arriving to work 2 hours before opening, she'd sit with a library book on the ivy-wound bench next to the wooden tool cabinet. The room was always balmy, but as early spring melted into late, the cool light crystallizing through the glass panes and crisp morning air were perfect for studying. Her mornings became quite pleasant, a vastly preferred alternative to hunching over her dim kitchen table with Juniper, who interrupted her with tidbits from the muck-raking magazine she scanned for the perfect sensationalized scandal. Willie was charged with tending to the greenhouse at dawn and dusk. The apprentice reminded her of her brother back when he was younger. At first, she suspected they merely shared the air of curiosity accompanying the position. But it was more. Their brown uniforms were perpetually lopsided in the same way. They'd avert their eyes when spoken to out of a respectful apprehension, and they were both detail-oriented to a fault. But there was one definite difference between them. If she smiled sweetly enough, Willie would fulfill her request, while her brother would have pinched her. His tasks did not interrupt her reading, but upon witnessing him go through the motions the first time, she had not expected him to take so long. Mr. Goronov's apothecary was only a third larger than the Pinovas, but it took Willie twice as long as her brother to complete his tasks. She suspected poor instruction, but as she saw him work out of the corner of her eye, she realized it was also due to a lack of assuredness. "You must stop second-guessing yourself," she said to him soon after she was hired, glancing over alchemy and other inorganic transformations by Emilio Serenio. Willie jumped, sloshing the water from his measuring cup. He cursed as the spill absorbed into the sandy floor and then poured all the remaining water from his cup into its pitcher so that he could start his measurements anew. "I'm not second-guessing, I'm double-checking. This is a Wilmnaria sprout. It needs exactly 7/8 of a cup and 1 tablespoon of water every third dawn." "I know." Josie slipped a bookmark between the pages, returned her reading glasses to her pocket, and rose to her feet. She grabbed a spare glass jar from atop the tool cabinet and handed it to Willie. "Pour the described amount in here." He looked at her dubiously, but did what he was told. His uncertain slowness nearly prompted an impatient Josie to snatch everything from his hands and do it herself. When he at last finished, a millennium later, he eyed the jar with a raised brow and asked,
And?
"Place it so it's level." She motioned toward a planter, and he balanced the jar on the ledge. Once the surface of the water settled, she traced the water line with her finger along the edge of the glass, outlined a splitting rune, and silently recited a spell. The jar broke apart at the water's surface. Willie's eyes widened at the casual display of magic. Josie plucked the top half of the glass away and gestured to the remaining vessel. "There you go. Be careful not to spill."
Thank you.
He gingerly raised the cup, refusing to ripple the water's smooth surface before emptying it onto the Wilmnaria.
But what is its purpose?
Josie smiled at him, hoping to turn his confusion to excitement through the force of her enthusiasm. "It's a measuring cup. Keep it by the Wilmnaria. This way, you do not need to measure out its increments each time. Simply fill the cup up to its brim, and you know you have the exact amount needed. I'm sure it'll save you time." He smiled wide, more childlike than boyish, and from then on he was fixed on her every word. She promised to come in early to help him at least once a week, and during their meetings, she managed to coax a few words from him. Today, he was telling her how he came to be an apprentice at Goronov's apothecary. Willie did not come from a family with any tradition of magic. They would learn the odd domestic spell here or there, but nothing substantial. His intuition for magic was nothing unusual, and he had just enough to pick up spell work at an average pace. It wasn't until he enrolled in a chemistry lab at his school that he discovered he could not only identify reactant substances by second sense, but he could also anticipate how two might react by how their magic did. One day, he had an inkling that Moorseed and ectopropyl might combust if combined, so he tested his hypothesis. After he nearly set the chemistry lab ablaze, his teachers recommended that he take an apothecary apprenticeship so that he could experiment in a controlled manner. Josie refrained from laughing at this particular admission. She made a mental note to include the anecdote in her next letter. Over the last several weeks of employment at the apothecary, she often shared vague details about her new job and her frustrations as she attempted to revive her new workplace. This inclusion would be a nice change of pace. But with a start, she remembered the letters would no longer be necessary, as she and Mr. Clark would be meeting in person this Friday, after institute decisions were projected to arrive. "But do you wish to one day become an apothecarist?" Josie asked Willie after he finished telling his story. He cocked his head before pushing his long hair from his eyes with the back of a dirt-dusted hand.
I did not sign up to be a botanist, but otherwise it's close enough.
Josie was about to ask what Willie thought about the threat the POWO possessed to his future livelihood when Mr. Reid walked into the greenhouse and her heart jumped. She had the displeasure of locking eyes with him and witnessing the exact moment he realized what the two of them were doing. Today, it was Josie demonstrating how to prune a kipyew shrub into its most comfortable shape. Mr. Reid's magic shifted with his frown as he approached with long strides. A lecture was imminent.
I know you mean well, but it's important that Willie learn how to care for the greenhouse on his own.
He stared down at them with crossed arms. Willie averted his gaze. He seemed neither distraught nor defeated. Either it was not in his nature to be insulted, or the normalcy of a scolding had pinched him into submission. Josie, on the other hand, refused to remain silent. "Oh, he knows how to care for it just fine. He just doesn't like it."
I didn't much like it either when I was an apprentice, but I did it.
Mr. Reid replied, unamused.
Without help.
Willie winced and still did not look up from his toes when he said,
It's not just that, but she's also teaching me many, tips and tricks to make me better.
Mr. Reid attempted to be encouraging but remained exasperated.
As long as you follow the regimen, everything will be fine. There isn't a need for tips or tricks.
That's where you're wrong, Josie interjected, determined to keep Mr. Reid from demeaning Willie's improvements. The apothecarist was, on paper, her superior. He had studied longer and wore a ring around his finger to prove it. But it did not mean that his expertise trumped hers, that she was always wrong, or that he and his apothecary's traditions were inherently superior.
Oh, really?
His eyes widened as his attention returned to her. He spoke slowly, mockingly, inviting her to embarrass herself. She detested how calm, how unbothered he always seemed to be.
Please, go on.
Instead of launching into a monologue, she said, "I'll let Willie explain what he's learned." Willie squeaked in protest.
I really don't want to.
She elbowed him. "William, if you would, please."
Fine,
He grumbled at the floor.
Well, as you know, Mr. Reid, every day I have to give words of affirmation to the grin palm at dawn and dusk. I'm not very good with thinking of new compliments, but just... Ms. Pinova gave me plenty.
Mr. Reid's magic flashed before reeling inward. She couldn't identify what for, and her only hint was his belittling smile through perfectly white teeth.
That's just silly. What's important is the energy of the affirmation itself. You don't need a million phrases.
It grows much better when you dedicate the time to complimenting it correctly, Josie insisted. Of course, he wouldn't understand the difference. If you were told, "You are so good," every single day by the same person with no variation, you wouldn't believe it, and the person repeating themselves would feel more like a skipping phonograph than someone bearing a genuine sentiment.
It's a plant?
He pointed to the grin palm beside them in question.
And it knows it's a good plant, that's all. There's no need to overcomplicate your intention.
Josie scowled at him before turning a bright smile onto the grin palm. My, what beautiful green leaves you have," she crooned. "What a wonderfully constructed stem. Your leaves are so wide. At least leave a little sunlight for your neighbors." As she spoke, elaborating on all the fine aspects of the plant between them, her magic shone brighter, livelier. Mr. Reid remained entirely still, and with no inkling of how adept his second sense was, she couldn't tell if he knew what was happening. The sun had risen above dawn, closer to noon, so the grin palm did not respond in kind, but she hoped that he could detect the substantial difference. Mr. Reid squinted at the shrub, attempting to determine if its improved lush shade of green was worth boasting about. The palm had flourished under her care in a way it never had before. Finally, Mr. Reid softened.
In the future, Ms. Pinova, if you have any suggestions, please inform either me or Mr. Goranov. We should be made aware of any changes to daily operations.
She should have nodded with an accompanying "yes, sir." Instead, she shook her head. "If I had come to you, you wouldn't have believed me." She attempted a laugh to lighten the mood, but she feared she only seemed hysterical. "You would have dismissed me if I didn't have a success story to show you." It was his turn to laugh, snappish and dry.
You cannot be serious. How can you blame me for a hypothetical? You have no way of knowing how I would have responded.
"Yes, I do." Not only was he easily predictable, but if she wanted a true prediction, she could ask Juniper. That would frighten him into never doubting her again. "You didn't even bother checking my soothing elixir before rejecting it," he replied flatly.
If Mr. Goranov wanted to place your elixir on the store shelves, he would have.
There was a fine line between apathy and obliviousness, and Mr. Reid wrote it well. The elixir was not the first time Josie had approached Mr. Goranov with a suggestion, and he always folded it away until Mr. Reid could review it. Mr. Goranov would then offhandedly ask Mr. Reid for his opinion, and the associate apothecarist would strike the proposition down without a second thought. He simply did not care enough to invest the time or energy into improving the shop. And because he never saw the potential, Mr. Goranov never acted on it. Josie stared at Mr. Reid. The odd customer who wandered into the shop and recognized her from the newspaper had more appreciation for her than he did, and they did not even know about her mailers or new recipes or the hours she spent optimizing the schedule. Her desire for efficiency was so thorough that she had even made a list of all of Mr. Goranov's personal supplements and daily medications and planned to make him a custom multivitamin. Mr. Reid could strike down as many of her ideas as he wanted, but she would find a way to supersede his judgment. She would do what she was hired to do.
Your elixir was not a viable product,
he said, breaking the tense silence.
It would have soured within a week, and we could not predict the demand. Our profit margins are much too thin. We cannot afford to take on the risk with only a month left to reach our quota."
She gritted her teeth, rebuking how he had labeled her product a burden to the apothecary. "We could have made them to order."
"We only prepare custom recipes to order,"
he replied, as if suggesting otherwise was blasphemous. She looked away, running her finger along the ugly scar that twisted across her palm from the bomb. She had accepted the risk of the place, both financial and physical, and had suffered through an explosion targeting the shop. It didn't matter what she said. Mr. Reid would contradict it on the grounds that she was the one who had said it. But she had survived and bled for this chance. And so, still, she tried to do something for this place. "I'm sure if we sent out a catalog of made-to-order—" Reid interrupted her with a sharp shake of his head.
"That's much too expensive. If you wanted your elixir stocked, perhaps you should have considered a preservative to ensure shelf stability. That is not my fault."
A preservative. All her breath left her lungs as she mulled the idea over. It was deceptively simple, but not a bad idea. In fact, it should have been obvious. "Perhaps you should have suggested it," she grumbled, still frustrated with him and finding it difficult to meet his discerning gaze. He was not her supervisor, so she did not know why it mattered so much to her that he find her competent rather than thoughtless.
"Well, in that case, I apologize,"
he said, placating her, as he clearly did not mean it. "As do I," she replied. She also did not mean it. Not in the slightest. He eyed her, but she did not continue. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked the other way, willing him to leave. She felt his stare linger on her for a beat longer than was appropriate, and she found herself inexplicably disappointed as she listened for some last word he might offer her, but was only met with the fading sound of sand crunching beneath his feet. It was quiet, calm. The soft pulse of the greenhouse's magic was like a salve on her wounded temperament. She doubted the university's apothecary had such an effect, and she wondered if it was possible to miss a place before she had left it. When Mr. Reid was far enough away for Josie to sense him only in her periphery, she returned to her bench and plopped down. She took a breath and was momentarily surprised to see Willie shuffling nearby, absorbed by his morning tasks. She had half forgotten he was there. "Are you all right?" she asked.
"Yeah."
He nodded while massaging the heavy leaves of an orchid palm.
"Mr. Reid hates any deviation from the rules. I think Mr. Gornov beat it into him. Once, I suggested adding a pinch of orgona to our tension release balm to assist in promoting liveliness, but he acted as if I asked to defile his grandmother's grave."
"That's very stupid." Josie knew that if she spent any more time contemplating Mr. Reid's stubbornness, she would devolve into insanity. "What is the point in being an apothecarist if you're so incurious? No wonder the profession is dead in the water."
"I don't think he chose it.
"What?"
To be an apothecarist, I mean."
Josie narrowed her eyes at him, as if inspecting for weak points. "What do you know?" Willie shrugged, refusing to look at her as he sprinkled a handful of water over a shrub.
"This all happened well before I was an apprentice, but I think I've gathered the gist of it. Mr. Gornov's late wife loved Mr. Reid."
Josie's heart nearly stopped in her chest. "What?"
"Not like that."
He shook his head vigorously, as if the motion could scrub away the thought of them together in that sense.
"She was like a mother to him, as I've understood it. She discovered him one day, not sure from where, and saw some sort of potential in him. She got him his apprenticeship."
Josie hadn't given much thought to Mr. Reid's upbringing. He had appeared in the shop fully formed and fully concerned with the present, so much so that she could not imagine him 5 years ago, let alone as a child. "What happened to her?"
"Died,"
Willie replied, simply, obviously.
"And when she did, Mr. Reid tried leaving too. He already had his ring."
She frowned. "Why'd he come back?" Willie set down his pitcher, finally finished with the morning's watering.
Where else would he go? He's a degree short of the university's apothecary and a waste of a ring anywhere else.
And Mr. Gorinov accepted him back. Josie had seen Mr. Gorinov angry, silent and seething, willing to snap at the slightest disturbance. The grief of losing a wife paired with losing an apothecarist he had spent half a decade training surely would do unspeakable things to his disposition.
Reid knew Mr. Gorinov was looking into pharmaceuticals because he was concerned about the shop. To prove that he was serious about the future of the apothecary, he signed up for a certification degree, I suppose. I have no way of knowing for sure.
Willie's eyes glazed over as something in the back of his mind captured his attention.
If anything, it's a shame that he's been trained in both and refuses to even try mixing them. I can just tell that Shalendar leaves and distilled Bernardo would produce a potent sleeping draught. Or a toxic gas. I'll need to attempt it to know for sure.
November 23rd, 1905. Dear Mr. Clark, you do not have to prove yourself to anyone, unless of course it is the University Admittance Council. I am not so conceited as to think that I would inspire a similar level of performance, but please never feel the need to peacock. I feel as if I already know your capability and your spirit. As for your question, I am applying without a listed concentration. My technical interview is scheduled in exactly a month, and during the proceedings, they will be examining me for any affinities or strengths. I hypothesized that if I applied broadly, I would have a better chance of becoming accepted in any department in need of help. I have been studying as broadly as possible. To be honest, I do not care what I study, as long as I am admitted, barring any branch of inorganic transmutation. I fear then I would request a transfer. I doubt I will be assigned to anything of the sort, as my transmutations are sloppy at best. Unfortunately, transmutations do include metallochemy. I am very sorry to sully your good concentration. It does interest me, even if I'm no good at it. I understand the theory well enough, but as with my glasses, I'm stuck teetering on the edge of discovery. If you care to share, I would love to hear what you've created recently. I know metallochemy concentrations need to submit a project for their technical interview. If you need any help with it, I'd be happy to offer any input, as I clearly have no interest in poaching your idea. Your friend, Ms. Davis.